8:06 a.m., December 7th, 1941. 1,177 men die in 9 seconds. The USS Arizona doesn't sink. It vaporizes. A single Japanese bomb penetrates 4 steel decks and detonates the forward powder magazines. The massive explosion lifts the ship's front section visibly out of the water before crashing back into Pearl Harbor. But here's what will blow your mind. This exact moment was planned by a man who attended Harvard, loved American baseball, and considered Americans his friends. His name was Isoroku Yamamoto. 11 months earlier, he told his government something that would haunt history. I can give you 6 months of victories. After that, we lose everything. He was right. Why do we ignore warnings? In the next 3 hours, you'll see how every single person, from radar operators to admirals to presidents, fell victim to patterns of denial that still kill people today. And it almost destroyed America. Before you judge these people for missing the signs, ask yourself this question. What obvious threat are you ignoring right now? Picture this scenario. You're at Harvard University in 1919. Your study partner is a friendly Japanese naval officer who speaks perfect English, loves poker, and wants to be friends forever. Fast forward 22 years, he's planning to kill your sons. That Japanese officer was Yamamoto. And here's the psychological twist. He understood America precisely because he had lived among Americans. He knew our habits, our weaknesses, our predictable routines. While American admirals studied Japanese culture through stereotypes and dismissed them as technologically inferior, Yamamoto studied Americans through genuine relationships. He learned that Americans were creatures of habit. Our battleships routinely moored in predictable patterns along what became known as Battleship Row. Many crew members took liberty on Sundays. We became vulnerable through routine. Yamamoto recognized how American patterns could become American weaknesses. But here's what makes this story even more unsettling. Yamamoto didn't want to fight America. He warned his government they would lose. He understood American industrial capacity better than most American politicians. When ordered to plan the attack anyway, he became the most dangerous kind of enemy, one who fights reluctantly but brilliantly. Think about the strategic calculation involved here. Yamamoto knew that Americans would be shocked by a surprise attack. He was counting on that shock to buy Japan time. What he didn't fully anticipate was how American shock would transform into systematic fury. This principle applies today when adversaries study American behavior patterns before striking. The more your enemy understands your routines, the more dangerous they become. Yamamoto proved that intimate knowledge breeds the deadliest strategies. December 7th didn't start with explosions. It started with 2 radar operators on duty in the early morning hours. Privates George Elliott and Joseph Lockhart were manning their station on the north shore of Oahu. At 7:02 a.m., they saw a massive return from a very large formation approaching Hawaii. The blip on their oscilloscope was unlike anything they'd seen before. Lockhart had never seen readings like this. He immediately called headquarters to report what appeared to be a significant air formation. Lieutenant Kermit Tyler's response was devastating in its casualness. He dismissed the contact, believing it was probably B-17 bombers expected from the mainland. A massive enemy formation became probably some B-17s. This represents a classic pattern of dismissing information that doesn't fit expectations. But the radar warning wasn't the only signal America missed. At 6:37 a.m., the destroyer USS Ward detected and sank a Japanese midget submarine attempting to enter Pearl Harbor. They literally fired the first shots of the Pacific War. The military command's response involved seeking verification of the Ward's report. Precious time was lost confirming what the destroyer's crew had witnessed directly. In 70 minutes, the need for verification would become tragically clear. This pattern of demanding proof of danger, instead of preparing for it, reflects how humans often reject information that disrupts their expectations. American military leaders struggled to believe Japan would attack Pearl Harbor, partly because such an attack seemed strategically irrational from an American perspective. Similar patterns appear throughout history, authorities dismissing early warnings that seem to contradict conventional wisdom. The tendency to normalize unusual signals has deadly consequences. So, how does the most powerful nation on Earth get caught defenseless by an enemy they've been watching for years? How does a Harvard-educated admiral outthink the entire American intelligence apparatus? The answer isn't in the explosions, it's in the assumptions. America, in 1941, was a country thinking in terms of yesterday's warfare, while tomorrow's war approached. We emphasized battleships, while our enemies perfected carrier aviation. We believed in American technological superiority, while our enemies studied American behavioral patterns. We relied on the Pacific Ocean as our protective barrier, while our enemies were crossing it in complete radio silence. But Japan made one crucial miscalculation. They thought shocking America would paralyze America. Instead, they awakened something far more dangerous, a sleeping giant with unlimited industrial capacity and a personal grudge. The explosion that destroyed the Arizona didn't just kill 1,100 sailors. It ended American isolationism. It shattered illusions about geographic safety. It transformed the global balance of power. And it accelerated America's emergence as the dominant world empire. Pearl Harbor didn't create American overseas presence. We already had bases in the Philippines, Guam, and the Canal Zone. But it dramatically accelerated our global military expansion and intelligence capabilities. Yamamoto got his 6 months of victories. Then, America spent the next 80 years ensuring Pearl Harbor could never happen again. But here's the question that should concern every American today. What attack are we not anticipating right now? Because if history teaches us anything, it's that great powers consistently prepare for the last war, while the next enemy plans something entirely different. December 6, 1941. America was so confident in its Pacific dominance that many battleship crews were looking forward to Christmas parties. Meanwhile, the most powerful naval strike force in history was approximately 230 miles away, invisible to most early warning systems. Only Opana's SCR-270 detected it, and that warning was dismissed. But this isn't really a story about Japanese brilliance. It's a story about American blindness. And that blindness follows a pattern that has destroyed every superpower in history. Here's the uncomfortable truth about superpowers. They don't fall because their enemies get stronger. They fall because they get comfortable. The Romans never saw the barbarians coming because Romans couldn't imagine anyone challenging Roman superiority. The British never saw American independence coming because Britain couldn't conceive of colonies rejecting the British Empire. And America in 1941 couldn't imagine Japan challenging American naval dominance in the Pacific. This is how every empire dies, not from external strength, but from internal assumptions. Think about Pearl Harbor's defenses on December 6th. No torpedo nets protecting our battleships. Why? Per contemporary naval doctrine, torpedo attacks were considered impossible in shallow water. The harbour was only 40 to 45 feet deep in most places. American naval experts believed that air-dropped torpedoes would plunge too deep and bury themselves in the mud before reaching their targets. The Japanese solved this problem with modified Type 91 torpedoes equipped with wooden tail fins and altered release techniques. Innovation defeated assumption. Our aircraft were parked wingtip to wingtip at Wheeler Field and Hickam Field. Why? General Walter Short prioritized anti-sabotage measures and dispersed aircraft accordingly. He bunched the planes together to make them easier to guard against ground infiltration. This made them perfect targets for aerial destruction. Our Pacific Fleet was moored in predictable rows on Sundays, reinforcing a sense of security and routine. American admirals believed these massive warships represented unshakable symbols of American power. The battleships looked impressive, lined up along what became known as Battleship Row. The Japanese turned American routine into American vulnerability. But here's what's really disturbing about American overconfidence in 1941. We had been watching Japan prepare for war for an entire decade. We knew they were building aircraft carriers. We knew they were training naval pilots. We knew they were expanding south into French Indochina and threatening British and Dutch territories. We just couldn't believe they would use those capabilities against us directly. We assumed rational enemies would avoid provoking American power. That assumption nearly destroyed us. American military leaders suffered from what we might call imperial projection. We assumed our enemies thought like Americans and would make American-style strategic calculations. From an American strategic perspective, attacking Pearl Harbor made no logical sense. It would bring the United States fully into the war. It would unify American public opinion behind military action. It would guarantee Japan faced the full weight of American industrial power. It would turn a regional Asian conflict into a global war. Japan couldn't win. Any reasonable enemy would avoid provoking America unnecessarily. But Japan wasn't thinking like America. They were thinking like a cornered animal with rapidly diminishing options. By late 1941, American economic sanctions had given Japan two stark choices: abandon their 4-year war in China or seize oil resources in the Dutch East Indies to continue fighting. Abandoning China meant political suicide for Japan's military-dominated government and the loss of everything they'd fought for since 1937. Seizing Dutch oil meant inevitable war with Britain, the Netherlands, and probably America. So Japan chose the third option Americans never seriously considered: strike first with maximum shock and hope to negotiate a favorable peace before American industrial power could be fully mobilized. This is the fatal flaw in superpower strategic thinking. When you're strong, you assume everyone else will calculate rationally and avoid confrontation. When you're desperate, rational calculation becomes a luxury you can't afford. Desperation breeds revolutionary thinking that comfortable powers can't anticipate. America learned this pattern repeatedly throughout the 20th century. We couldn't understand why North Vietnam wouldn't accept American-backed democracy in South Vietnam. We couldn't comprehend why Middle Eastern populations would resist American-sponsored liberation from dictatorships. We consistently projected American logic onto non-American situations and were repeatedly surprised by irrational resistance. The stronger you become, the harder it gets to think like desperate enemies. Success breeds strategic blindness that can be catastrophic. This exact psychological pattern plays out in business disruption every single day. Blockbuster couldn't imagine customers wanting to stream movies instead of renting physical DVDs. Too inconvenient with dial-up internet. Too expensive for movie studios. Too unreliable with existing technology. Netflix destroyed them by making the impossible inevitable. BlackBerry couldn't conceive of customers wanting touchscreen phones instead of physical keyboards for business communication. Too fragile for professional use. Too impractical for serious email. Too different from proven business workflows. The iPhone revolutionized mobile communication while BlackBerry was still arguing about keyboard efficiency. Kodak invented digital photography in 1975, but couldn't believe customers would abandon film for electronic images. Too low quality for professional use. Too expensive for mass adoption. Too complicated for average consumers. Digital cameras killed the film industry while Kodak executives were still debating image resolution standards. The pattern never changes. Market leaders analyze their competitors through the lens of their own successful business models. They assume everyone else will play by established industry rules. Then, someone changes the fundamental rules completely. America in 1941 was Blockbuster. Japan was Netflix. We were still thinking in terms of traditional battleship warfare while they were perfecting integrated carrier aviation. We were preparing to fight the last war's tactics while they were inventing the next war's strategy. We were defending against conventional attacks while they were planning unconventional shock operations. But here's where the parallel gets even more unsettling. Blockbuster's executives knew Netflix existed and were tracking their subscriber growth. BlackBerry's engineers knew about touchscreen technology and had prototypes in development. Kodak's researchers invented digital photography and understood its potential applications. They all saw the disruptive threat coming. They just couldn't believe it would successfully challenge their market dominance. American intelligence knew Japan had 6 large aircraft carriers and hundreds of trained pilots. American naval attachés knew Japan had been practicing coordinated carrier operations. American codebreakers knew Japan was planning major military operations somewhere in the Pacific. We saw the strategic threat developing. We just couldn't believe it would work against American naval supremacy. America in 1941 was comfortable in ways that seem almost unimaginable today. Dangerously comfortable. We possessed the world's largest economy, with massive industrial infrastructure capable of mass-producing everything from automobiles to aircraft. By mid-war, the United States would produce roughly around 40% of certain global war-related manufacturing output. We had 2 vast oceans, protecting our homeland from any conceivable foreign invasion. We had never lost a major war fought on American territory. Many Americans were largely disconnected from Asia. Pearl Harbor and the Philippines were distant and unfamiliar to much of the public. Foreign wars seemed like distant European or Asian problems that didn't affect American security. international military threats felt remote and irrelevant to daily American life. This wasn't ignorance, it was the luxury of geographic security. When you're powerful enough, distant conflicts become irrelevant to daily life. When you're secure enough, foreign wars become other people's concerns. But luxury breeds strategic vulnerability. While American families were buying new automobiles and planning Christmas vacations, Japanese families were rationing rice and metal for total war mobilization. While American factories were producing consumer appliances and luxury goods, Japanese factories were converting entirely to military production. While American newspapers covered football games and Hollywood movies, Japanese media was psychologically preparing the population for death before defeat. We were living in peacetime abundance while our enemies were preparing for wartime sacrifice. That psychological asymmetry gave them advantages we never anticipated. When comfortable societies face desperate enemies, comfort becomes a strategic liability. When peaceful nations confront fully militarized societies, peace becomes an immediate weakness. When prosperous populations face populations prepared to die for their beliefs, prosperity becomes a vulnerability. Japan understood this psychological asymmetry and built their entire strategy around exploiting it. They were betting that soft Americans couldn't sustain a long, brutal war against disciplined Japanese warriors willing to die for their emperor. They were counting on American comfort to defeat American power before American industry could be fully mobilized for global conflict. They were completely wrong about American character under pressure, but they were absolutely right about American preparation and psychological readiness in December 1941. We weren't ready for the war that was coming because we couldn't imagine the war that was possible. Here's the most disturbing aspect about Pearl Harbor. American intelligence capabilities were actually quite sophisticated for 1941. We were successfully intercepting and decrypting Japanese diplomatic communications through a program called MAGIC. We knew Japan was planning to break off negotiations and initiate military operations somewhere in the Pacific theater. We could track Japanese naval movements throughout Southeast Asia and monitor their preparations for coordinated attacks. The fundamental problem wasn't lack of information. The problem was an overwhelming abundance of information pointing toward plausible but incorrect targets. Every piece of intercepted intelligence suggested Japan would attack American, British, and Dutch territories in Southeast Asia, specifically the Philippines, Thailand, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. Those attacks made perfect strategic sense from any rational analysis. They would give Japan the oil and rubber resources they desperately needed. They would eliminate European and American colonial power throughout Asia. They would establish Japan as the undisputed hegemon of the entire Pacific region. What didn't make strategic sense was attacking Pearl Harbor directly. It seemed like unnecessary provocation that would guarantee American entry into the war without providing Japan any vital resources. So American intelligence focused completely on protecting MacArthur's forces in the Philippines, while treating Hawaii as a secondary concern. Washington prioritized reinforcements for the Philippines and Southeast Asia, which contributed to gaps in Hawaii's readiness. We positioned our best submarines and long-range aircraft to defend Southeast Asian approaches, while maintaining only partial patrol coverage around Hawaii that missed the Japanese approach sector. This represents a classic intelligence failure pattern. You collect so much information that you begin filtering it through your own strategic assumptions. You focus on threats that make sense and ignore possibilities that seem irrational. You see what confirms your existing analysis and miss what contradicts your fundamental premises. The Japanese understood this analytical weakness and exploited it brilliantly. Their strict radio silence and obvious movements elsewhere amplified our existing assumptions. They used American analytical sophistication against American strategic imagination. But here's the crucial limitation. While magic intercepts revealed Japan's diplomatic intentions and general military preparations, they did not reveal Pearl Harbor as the specific target. Japanese operational naval codes remained largely unbroken, protecting their tactical plans. American intelligence knew war was coming, but couldn't pinpoint where it would begin. Modern intelligence agencies study Pearl Harbor as the definitive example of analytical failure, not because we lacked information, but because we had too much information pointing in plausible directions and too little imagination for implausible possibilities. Intelligence success requires balancing analytical rigor with strategic creativity. The more sophisticated your analysis becomes, the harder it gets to imagine your enemies might be completely irrational. Here's the argument that makes many Americans deeply uncomfortable. Maybe America needed Pearl Harbor to happen exactly as it did. By December 1941, Nazi Germany controlled most of continental Europe from Norway to Greece. German armies were advancing toward Moscow and Leningrad, threatening to knock the Soviet Union out of the war entirely. Britain was barely surviving massive bombing campaigns and submarine warfare that threatened to starve the island into surrender. The entire democratic world was losing World War II, while America remained officially neutral. President Roosevelt understood that America needed to enter the European war to prevent Nazi victory. But American public opinion remained firmly opposed to European military involvement after the disasters of World War I. Congress would not declare war on Germany without direct provocation. The military was not psychologically or materially prepared for simultaneous global conflict on multiple fronts. Without Pearl Harbor forcing American entry, democracy might have died in Europe and Asia, while America remained safely isolated. Britain might have negotiated peace with Hitler. The Soviet Union might have collapsed under German pressure. Japan might have conquered all of Southeast Asia and China without American interference. Some historians argue this was Japan's greatest strategic miscalculation, not the tactical decision to attack Pearl Harbor, but the strategic decision to force America to choose between continued isolation and permanent global empire. Before December 7th, America was a reluctant great power with limited international commitments. After December 7th, America became a committed global hegemon with permanent worldwide military responsibilities. The surprise attack that was designed to keep America out of the Pacific War instead transformed America into the world's permanent military superpower. Japan wanted to shock America into accepting Japanese dominance of Asia. Instead, they shocked America into accepting American dominance of the entire world. But this raises profoundly uncomfortable questions about American democracy and foreign policy. Do we need external enemies to maintain internal unity? Do we need foreign threats to overcome our natural tendency toward comfortable isolationism? Do we need periodic crises to justify the massive military expenditures that maintain global hegemony? Pearl Harbor ended the luxury of American neutrality permanently. We have been continuously mobilized for global military intervention ever since. Whether that represents victory or tragedy depends entirely on your perspective about American empire and global responsibility. The sleeping giant that Japan awakened has never gone back to sleep. But if America suffered from dangerous overconfidence about its own security, Japan suffered from equally dangerous overconfidence about its own capabilities. Japanese military leaders believed their spiritual discipline and warrior culture would overcome American material advantages in any prolonged conflict. They thought highly trained Japanese soldiers and pilots could consistently defeat larger numbers of soft American civilians who lacked proper military spirit. They assumed that shocking America with a devastating surprise attack would paralyze American decision-making rather than enrage American public opinion. Every single assumption proved catastrophically wrong. Japan's strategic delusion was the perfect mirror image of America's tactical delusion. We underestimated our enemy's desperation and willingness to take enormous risks. They underestimated our capacity for systematic industrial violence once our comfortable assumptions were shattered. Both countries were about to receive brutal education about the dangers of strategic overconfidence. The crucial difference was that America's enormous industrial base could survive its initial mistakes and learn from catastrophic failure. Japan's limited resources could not. But in December 1941, those harsh lessons lay in an unknowable future. All America knew was that Sunday morning had begun peaceful and comfortable and was about to become violent and transformative. The sleeping giant was about to wake up angry, and when it did, the balance of global power would shift permanently. Picture Harvard University in 1919. World War I has just ended. American students are returning from European battlefields, optimistic about making the world safe for democracy. Among them walks a Japanese naval officer, 35 years old, who speaks excellent English and shows keen interest in American culture. His name is Isoroku Yamamoto. He's here as a special student, studying American language, customs, and strategic thinking. He immerses himself in American life, attending baseball games, studying language and industry, and absorbs what he can about American society. 22 years later, this same man would conceive and oversee the planning of the Pearl Harbor strike. But here's what makes Yamamoto's story so psychologically complex. He became America's most dangerous enemy precisely because he understood America so well. He didn't attack us despite his exposure to American culture. He attacked us because he understood American patterns and vulnerabilities. And that should concern anyone who thinks about modern warfare and intelligence. Yamamoto's relationship with America began with his Harvard assignment in 1919, when the Japanese Navy sent him for 2 years of intensive study. This posting doubled as intensive study of American institutions, experience with clear strategic value. He threw himself into American academic life with apparent enthusiasm. He studied English literature and American history, learned American slang and social customs, attended baseball games, and observed American fascination with statistics and individual performance within team frameworks. Most importantly, he learned to analyze how Americans approached strategic problems. American military leaders studied Japan through racial stereotypes and cultural assumptions, seeing Japanese soldiers as small, nearsighted, inferior pilots who could never match American technological superiority. They assumed Japanese strategy would follow predictable patterns based on Western interpretations of Asian military thinking. Yamamoto studied Americans through direct observation and systematic analysis. He saw American soldiers as individually creative, but dependent on superior equipment and logistics. He understood that American strategy emphasized overwhelming material advantage rather than spiritual discipline. More crucially, he observed that Americans found comfort in routine and predictability, even while emphasizing flexibility in doctrine. After Harvard, the Japanese Navy sent him to Washington, D.C. as naval attaché from 1925 to 1927. This gave him 2 more years studying American military and political culture, observing naval exercises, analyzing industrial capacity, and watching congressional debates about military spending. By 1927, Yamamoto had gained deep insights into American naval practice and industrial capacity that many Japanese contemporaries lacked. And that knowledge would shape his strategic thinking for the next 15 years. Here's the psychological complexity that makes Yamamoto's story fascinating. He never wanted to fight America. Throughout the 1930s, as Japan expanded into China and tensions escalated with the United States, Yamamoto consistently argued against war with America. He warned Japanese political leaders that fighting America would be national suicide. He understood American industrial capacity in ways his colleagues could not fully grasp. He warned repeatedly that Japan could win decisive victories early, commonly summarized as 6 months to a year of success, but could not sustain a long industrial war with the United States. This wasn't false modesty or strategic deception. This was genuine strategic analysis based on direct observation of American capabilities. Yamamoto had toured American factories during the Great Depression. He knew what American industry could produce when fully mobilized. He understood that America's greatest military weapon wasn't any specific technology. It was the ability to mass-produce advanced technology faster than enemies could destroy it. Japanese military leaders dismissed his warnings. They believed spiritual discipline and warrior culture would overcome American material advantages. They assumed soft Americans would collapse under pressure from disciplined Japanese attacks. Yamamoto knew better. He had observed American character during economic crisis and noted their systematic response to adversity. Americans might be unprepared for war, but once committed, they would fight with methodical determination until victory was achieved. But when his government decided on war anyway, Yamamoto faced a terrible choice: refuse orders and end his career, or plan the best possible war strategy for an impossible situation. He chose to serve his country by planning its most audacious military gamble. The man who understood America's industrial capacity better than most Japanese leaders became the architect of Japan's desperate attempt to neutralize American power before it could be fully mobilized. Yamamoto's American education gave him insights that proved both valuable and dangerous. He recognized something American admirals had never fully examined about themselves: the gap between American doctrine and American routine. American military doctrine emphasized flexibility and individual initiative. Officers were trained to adapt tactics to changing circumstances. Strategy was supposedly based on creative responses to unexpected challenges. But American implementation followed comfortable patterns. Yamamoto had observed this contradiction during his Washington assignment. American military leaders talked about adaptability while maintaining predictable schedules. They emphasized flexibility while following routine procedures. The Pacific Fleet's weekend routine was a telling example. Ships would be moored in organized formations on Sundays. Most crews would take shore leave, and harbor defenses would operate on reduced alert during supposedly peaceful periods. American admirals considered this smart resource management. Yamamoto saw it as pattern vulnerability. Americans became predictably relaxed when they felt secure. His American education had also taught him that Americans believed in their own technological superiority with deep conviction. They assumed their equipment was better, their methods more advanced, and their strategic thinking more sophisticated than any conceivable enemy. This confidence could become strategic blindness. Americans struggled to imagine enemies successfully challenging American naval supremacy because Americans couldn't conceive of anyone being more innovative than Americans in military technology. Yamamoto designed his attack to exploit this assumption. He planned operations so technically challenging that American experts would consider them impossible: torpedo attacks in shallow water, coordinated carrier operations across thousands of miles, complete radio silence maintained by an entire fleet for 2 weeks. American naval doctrine declared each element impractical or impossible. Yamamoto made them inevitable through superior preparation and understanding of enemy psychology. Yamamoto's strategic thinking was shaped by his American experience in ways that pure Japanese military culture could never have provided. He understood American economic capacity not as abstract statistics, but as observable industrial processes he had witnessed personally. During his time in America, he had toured automobile factories, steel mills, and aircraft manufacturing plants. He had seen American mass production techniques that Japanese industry was only beginning to adopt. He understood that American industrial capacity was not just larger than Japan's, it was qualitatively different in organization and potential output. American factories could retool for military production with speeds Japanese planners couldn't fully comprehend. American logistics networks could support global military operations on scales Japanese resources could never match. This knowledge led to his famous strategic warning about time limitations. Yamamoto calculated that Japan had approximately 6 months to a year before American industry could fully mobilize for global war production. During that window, Japan's existing military advantages could achieve decisive victories. After that period, American industrial capacity would begin producing military equipment faster than Japan could destroy it. American numerical superiority would become overwhelming. Japan would face inevitable defeat through material exhaustion unless the war ended quickly. The only possible Japanese strategy was to achieve such devastating early victories that America would negotiate peace rather than endure prolonged industrial mobilization for total war. Pearl Harbor was designed to buy those crucial months by eliminating America's ability to interfere with Japanese expansion throughout the Pacific. It was a desperate mathematical gamble based on intimate knowledge of American capabilities and strategic assumptions. And it almost worked exactly as planned. The British Taranto raid was closely studied by the Imperial Japanese Navy and helped inform Japanese thinking about harbour strikes. British carrier aircraft had successfully attacked Italian battleships in harbour using obsolete biplanes in November 1940, demonstrating that air power could neutralize naval supremacy through surprise rather than superior aircraft performance. But Yamamoto saw strategic possibilities British planners had not fully explored. Taranto had been a limited attack designed to damage Italian naval operations temporarily. Pearl Harbor could be a decisive attack designed to eliminate American naval capacity for months. The psychological impact would be even more important than material damage. Americans had never experienced successful foreign attack on American territory. A devastating surprise assault would shatter American assumptions about geographic security and naval invincibility. He correctly predicted American shock. He miscalculated American response patterns. Americans responded to Pearl Harbor with systematic fury that combined immediate industrial mobilization with strategic patience for long-term victory. Yamamoto had studied American behavior extensively during peacetime, but he had never observed Americans during existential conflict that threatened their fundamental assumptions about security. That gap in his analytical foundation would prove fatal to Japanese strategy. From a tactical perspective, Yamamoto's Pearl Harbor plan was nearly flawless. He had identified American vulnerabilities with surgical precision and designed countermeasures for every conceivable defense. Shallow water torpedo problem, solved with modified ordnance and delivery techniques. Long-range navigation challenge, solved with extensive training and precise weather analysis. Early detection risk, solved with radio silence and northern approach route. The plan demonstrated Japanese tactical superiority in multiple technical dimensions. But the plan contained one fatal strategic miscalculation that Yamamoto's American education should have taught him to avoid. It solved the wrong fundamental problem. Yamamoto designed Pearl Harbor to neutralize American naval power in the Pacific temporarily. But America's greatest strategic weapon was never its existing Pacific fleet. America's greatest weapon was its industrial capacity to build new fleets faster than enemies could sink them. Pearl Harbor destroyed battleships and damaged naval facilities. It didn't destroy shipyards or industrial infrastructure. It eliminated existing naval power temporarily, but didn't eliminate the ability to create vastly superior naval power. More crucially, Pearl Harbor solved Japan's tactical problem while guaranteeing Japan's strategic nightmare. It removed immediate American naval interference with Japanese expansion, but guaranteed complete American industrial mobilization for unlimited war. Yamamoto had studied American factories and understood American production capabilities better than most Japanese leaders. He knew that fully mobilized American industry could outproduce Japanese industry by margins that made prolonged war mathematically impossible for Japan. But he gambled that shocking America would prevent full American mobilization by leading to negotiated settlement. He believed devastating surprise attack would create political pressure for compromise rather than total war. His American education had taught him about American industrial capacity and peacetime political behavior. It hadn't taught him about American moral capacity for sustained righteous anger when fundamental assumptions about security were shattered. That psychological miscalculation transformed brilliant tactical success into inevitable strategic catastrophe. Yamamoto's story reveals something important about modern intelligence analysis. Intimate knowledge of your enemy can become a strategic liability if you mistake tactical understanding for complete strategic wisdom. He understood American military procedures, industrial processes, and cultural patterns with remarkable accuracy for a foreign observer. He correctly identified American weaknesses and designed effective countermeasures. He predicted many American responses with impressive precision. But he underestimated something that couldn't be observed through peacetime contact: American capacity for fundamental transformation under extreme pressure. Americans in peacetime were indeed comfortable, routine-oriented, and strategically complacent about distant threats. Americans at war became systematically violent, industrially focused, and strategically relentless until victory was achieved. Yamamoto had never observed Americans fight a total war that threatened their core assumptions. His Harvard education occurred during peaceful post-war period. His Washington assignment came during isolationist years. He knew peaceful Americans, but had never seen Americans aroused to existential conflict. This gap proved fatal. He planned for war against the America he had studied, rather than the America that total war would create. By December 7th, 1941, Yamamoto had become one of the world's leading experts on American military capabilities and strategic thinking. He knew more about American industrial capacity than many American military leaders understood. But expertise became overconfidence. Knowledge became assumption. Understanding became misunderstanding of American potential under pressure. The enemy who knew America best became the enemy who misunderstood America most completely when it mattered most. And in 6 months, at the Battle of Midway, American forces would destroy 4 of the aircraft carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto's perfect tactical plan would accelerate Japan's strategic destruction. The Harvard-educated admiral who planned America's devastation had taught America exactly how to devastate Japan. In spring 1941, a Japanese consular clerk arrived in Honolulu. He was in his late 20s and working under diplomatic cover. He looked like any other visitor to Hawaii, polite, curious, eager to see the sights and learn about American culture. His name was Takeo Yoshikawa. He spoke fluent English and had an encyclopedic knowledge of American naval vessels. Over the next several months, he would photograph, map, and carefully record ship movements, defenses, and routines at Pearl Harbor in one of the most successful open-source intelligence operations of the era. What makes Yoshikawa's story so disturbing isn't just what he accomplished. It's how easily he accomplished it. He spent months conducting detailed surveillance of America's most important naval base, and nobody suspected a thing. Why? Because Americans couldn't believe a Japanese spy would be that obvious. Yoshikawa arrived in Honolulu under diplomatic cover as a clerk at the Japanese consulate. His official duties involved routine paperwork and cultural liaison work with the local Japanese-American community. His actual mission was to gather detailed intelligence on Pearl Harbor's defenses, ship movements, and daily routines. But here's what made his operation brilliant. He didn't act like a spy. Traditional espionage involves secret meetings, coded messages, and elaborate deceptions to avoid detection. Yoshikawa took the opposite approach. He acted like an enthusiastic tourist who couldn't get enough of American naval power. According to reports, he would spend hours at elevated vantage points overlooking Pearl Harbor, appearing to enjoy the scenery while systematically observing naval operations. American sailors and their families frequented nearby establishments, casually discussing ship schedules and duty assignments. Yoshikawa listened to everything while appearing to be just another interested observer. Local residents found him charming, polite, well-dressed, and genuinely interested in Hawaiian culture. He asked intelligent questions about American naval operations that seemed to come from natural curiosity rather than strategic intelligence gathering. Local authorities noted his presence, but did not classify him as a significant operational threat. A Japanese diplomat showing interest in American military capabilities seemed normal and harmless. They couldn't imagine that someone would conduct serious espionage so openly. This psychological blindness was exactly what Yoshikawa was counting on. He exploited the most dangerous human bias. They would never be that obvious thinking. Americans thought real spies would be secretive and suspicious, so Yoshikawa became visible and friendly instead. The best surveillance is invisible surveillance conducted in plain sight. Yoshikawa's intelligence-gathering methods were breathtakingly simple and devastatingly effective. Every weekend, he would reportedly hire taxi drivers to take him on sightseeing tours around Oahu, asking to see Pearl Harbor from different vantage points and explaining that he was fascinated by American naval power. Drivers were happy to accommodate a polite paying customer. During these tours, Yoshikawa would photograph ships, count aircraft, and time patrol schedules. His camera looked like standard tourist equipment, and his behavior seemed like normal visitor curiosity. But his observations were methodically professional. He documented which ships were present on which days of the week, timed guard rotations and shift changes, noted which areas had heavy security and which were lightly protected, and identified the best approach routes for aircraft and submarines. Most remarkably, Yoshikawa used public vantage points on land and from civilian transport to obtain aerial and elevated views of the harbour. Tourist flights around Hawaiian Islands weren't illegal or even unusual. But Yoshikawa used these opportunities to photograph Pearl Harbor from angles that ground-based observation couldn't provide. He captured detailed images of ship positions, defensive installations, and harbor geography. He identified fuel storage facilities, repair docks, ammunition depots, approach channels, and emergency anchorages. American military security never questioned civilian access to areas overlooking their most sensitive naval base. They assumed tourist activities posed no intelligence threat. Yoshikawa proved them catastrophically wrong. His photographs and reports were used by Japanese planners as important input for attack planning and target selection. What made Yoshikawa's operation truly exceptional was his integration into local social networks. He didn't just observe Pearl Harbor from a distance, he cultivated relationships with people who worked there. Hawaii had a large Japanese-American population in 1941. Many worked as civilians on military bases, in defense plants, and in businesses that served military personnel. Yoshikawa developed connections with these community members through cultural events, religious activities, and social gatherings. He never asked direct questions about military secrets. Instead, he encouraged people to talk about their work, their schedules, and their observations of daily military routine. People shared information freely because they trusted him as a fellow member of their community. This social intelligence gathering provided insights that external observation could never achieve. He learned about internal security procedures, personnel changes, upcoming exercises, officer authorities, and communication patterns. Most disturbing of all, Yoshikawa developed what appeared to be genuine personal relationships with some of his intelligence sources. He participated in community activities and cultural celebrations, relationships that seemed to extend beyond purely professional intelligence gathering. Then, he used those connections to help plan attacks that would kill his neighbors and acquaintances. This represents a form of psychological compartmentalization that most people find difficult to comprehend. Yoshikawa could simultaneously maintain personal relationships while planning operations that would harm those same people. Modern intelligence agencies study this phenomenon as an example of how professional operatives can maintain emotional detachment from the consequences of their actions. It's also a reminder that the most dangerous enemies are often the ones who understand us well enough to operate within our communities. The intelligence Yoshikawa provided to Tokyo was remarkably detailed and tactically valuable. He didn't just report general information about American naval strength, he provided specific operational intelligence that Japanese attack planners could use immediately. His reports included precise ship movements, and mooring patterns, documenting that battleships were typically moored along the southeast side of Ford Island on Sunday mornings, and identifying which ships were present on specific dates. He provided detailed timing information about personnel schedules, when crews took shore leave, when guard shifts changed, and when base alerts were typically scheduled. He understood daily routine patterns that could be exploited for maximum surprise. Most critically, Yoshikawa provided tactical intelligence about harbor defenses and approach routes. He identified radar installations, anti-aircraft gun positions, patrol boat schedules, underwater obstacles, entrance channels, and emergency anchorage areas. His intelligence reports were so comprehensive that Japanese pilots could plan their attack routes, target selections, and escape procedures based heavily on information he provided. But perhaps most valuable was his psychological intelligence about American security assumptions. He reported that Americans believed Pearl Harbor was invulnerable to air attack, and documented their confidence in geographic isolation and technological superiority. This psychological profile was as important as tactical information. It told Japanese planners that Americans weren't prepared for unconventional attacks because they couldn't imagine anyone successfully challenging American naval supremacy. Yoshikawa's intelligence operation was so successful that Japanese attack commanders knew more about Pearl Harbor's daily routine than many American officers stationed there. Yoshikawa's techniques seem almost primitive compared to modern surveillance technology, but his fundamental approach, hiding espionage within normal activity, remains the gold standard for intelligence operations. Today's equivalent might be social media monitoring that masquerades as marketing research, corporate intelligence gathering that pretends to be competitive analysis, or academic exchanges that serve as technology transfer operations. The principle never changes. The best espionage doesn't look like espionage. Modern intelligence agencies use Yoshikawa's Pearl Harbor operation as a case study in open-source intelligence gathering. His methods demonstrate how enormous amounts of sensitive information can be collected through seemingly innocent activities. Consider how much intelligence a foreign operative could gather today just through publicly available information. Satellite imagery, social media posts, corporate websites, government publications, and news reports. Add personal networking and legitimate business relationships, and the intelligence potential becomes overwhelming. Yoshikawa proved that you don't need to steal classified documents if you can observe classified activities. Don't need to hack computer systems if you can befriend people who use those systems. And don't need elaborate technological capabilities if you have patience, observational skills, and social intelligence. The most sophisticated security systems in the world remain vulnerable to human psychology and social engineering. This is why foreign governments can monitor American behavior through social platforms, why your smart devices collect conversation data and report back to corporate databases, and why seemingly innocent business relationships can become intelligence pipelines. The surveillance is invisible because we've been conditioned to accept it as normal technological convenience or cultural exchange. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, Takeo Yoshikawa was probably in his Honolulu apartment when the first Japanese bombs began falling on Pearl Harbor. His neighbors, people who had trusted him, befriended him, and shared their lives with him, were about to die from intelligence he had provided. The attack routes he had mapped would guide Japanese aircraft to their targets, and the timing information he had gathered would maximize American casualties. American security officials who had dismissed him as a harmless diplomat would spend the rest of their careers wondering how they had missed such an extensive intelligence operation. But Yoshikawa's success wasn't due to American incompetence. it was due to American psychology. Americans, in 1941, lived in a society where foreign visitors were generally welcome, where curiosity about military affairs seemed natural, and where social trust was the default assumption. These cultural strengths became strategic vulnerabilities when exploited by professional intelligence operatives. The same openness that made America attractive to immigrants and visitors also made America vulnerable to enemies who understood how to weaponize that openness. Yoshikawa demonstrated that the most effective spies aren't the ones who hide in shadows, they're the ones who hide in plain sight, using our own cultural assumptions against us. Months of smiling, observing, and building relationships had given Japan everything it needed to devastate the American Pacific Fleet. The invisible spy had mapped America's doom with a tourist's camera and careful conversation, and nobody saw it coming. In late November 1941, Ambassador Kichisaburo Nomura presented what Tokyo described as a final proposal, one exchange in a series of drafts and meetings between late November 20th and 26th that coincided with fleet movements. He smiles, bows politely, and presents the document to Secretary of State Cordell Hull with apparent sincerity. Meanwhile, the Japanese strike force was already at sea, steaming toward its rendezvous and maintaining strict radio silence. Historians debate the extent to which late November diplomacy was deliberate deception versus genuine bargaining. The chronology, however, is clear. Negotiations and military preparations overlapped. Japan wasn't simply trying to prevent war, they were trying to control when and how it would begin. And they were using America's faith in diplomatic solutions to make any surprise attack more devastating. By November 1941, Japan had been planning the Pearl Harbor attack for months. Pilots were training, ships were being positioned, and intelligence was being gathered. But they were also conducting intensive diplomatic negotiations with the United States, discussing compromises and seeking what appeared to be peaceful solutions to their conflicts. How is this possible? How do you plan military operations while shaking hands and talking about peace? The answer reveals something important about how nations behave when they've already decided that diplomatic solutions alone won't achieve their objectives. Continued negotiations can become a weapon for maximizing surprise and managing international perceptions. Japan's diplomatic strategy served multiple purposes simultaneously. They made proposals that addressed some American concerns, but preserved core Japanese interests in ways that would be difficult for American policymakers to accept. When America rejected these proposals, Japan could argue they had exhausted diplomatic alternatives before turning to military ones. More importantly, the ongoing negotiations kept American attention focused on talking rather than final military preparations. While American officials debated the merits of various Japanese proposals, Japanese military forces were moving into position for coordinated operations. The longer the negotiations continued, the more Americans hoped war might still be avoided. The more Americans hoped war might be avoided, the less urgently they prepared for war that Japanese leaders increasingly saw as inevitable. Japan used American diplomatic optimism and procedural traditions to gain tactical advantages for military operations. Japan's late November proposal represented their final attempt to achieve strategic objectives through negotiated settlement rather than military conquest. On paper, it included significant Japanese concessions that might appeal to American policymakers seeking peaceful resolution. Japan offered to withdraw military forces from southern Indochina and halt further southward expansion into Southeast Asia. They promised to reduce their military presence in northern Indochina and limit their activities in that region to economic development. They even suggested they might consider partial withdrawal from some occupied territories in China under certain conditions. In exchange, they requested American concessions that seemed relatively modest: restore normal commercial relations, provide petroleum products, and reduce military support for Chinese resistance forces. To observers unfamiliar with the broader strategic context, this might have looked like Japan offering substantial concessions in exchange for limited American compromises. Why wouldn't America accept such an apparently reasonable arrangement? But many elements of Tokyo's proposals and long-range aircraft were structured in ways that would be difficult for US policymakers to accept while preserving American strategic interests and moral commitments. Japan offered to withdraw from southern Indochina, but wanted to maintain military forces in northern Indochina indefinitely. They promised to halt further expansion, but expected American recognition of all their existing conquests since 1937. They suggested considering withdrawal from China, but only after China accepted Japanese terms for permanent control of key strategic territories and resources. Most significantly, they demanded that America end military aid to Chinese resistance, while Japan continued fighting to complete their conquest of China. This would virtually guarantee Japanese victory in their 4-year war, while making America complicit in Chinese defeat. No American government could accept these terms without abandoning fundamental strategic interests and moral principles regarding international aggression. Japanese leaders understood this reality. Many elements of their proposals appeared crafted to be unacceptable to American interests, while providing Japan with justification for claiming American diplomatic intransigence. The proposal served Japanese interests, whether America accepted it or rejected it. What makes Japan's diplomatic strategy psychologically complex is that some Japanese diplomats may have genuinely believed their proposals represented reasonable compromises that America should accept. They had convinced themselves that America should recognize Japanese achievements in Asia because the alternative was a war that would harm everyone involved. This represents a common pattern in international relations. Nations that have achieved their objectives through force often convince themselves that other nations should accept these achievements as established facts rather than continuing to resist them. Japanese leaders told themselves they were being generous by offering any concessions at all. They had conquered most of what they wanted through military campaigns. Why shouldn't America accept Japanese success as a fait accompli and work within the new strategic reality? From the Japanese perspective, American resistance to Japanese expansion was the primary source of conflict in the Pacific. If America would simply accept Japanese leadership in East Asia, there would be no need for further military confrontation. American stubbornness was forcing Japan to consider military solutions to what should be political problems. This psychological framework allowed Japanese diplomats to negotiate with apparent sincerity while their military completed preparations for surprise attacks. They weren't necessarily lying about wanting peace. They genuinely wanted peace on Japanese terms, which required American acceptance of Japanese regional dominance. When America refused to accept those terms, Japan could honestly claim they had tried diplomacy, and America had chosen continued confrontation instead. This rationalization appears throughout history whenever powerful nations decide to attack neighbors who resist their expansion. The aggressor always claims the victim forced them to use violence by refusing to accept reasonable demands. The psychology of self-justification makes even aggressive warfare feel defensive to those who initiate it. American leaders faced an impossible choice in late November 1941. They could accept Japan's proposal and become complicit in Japanese aggression throughout Asia, or they could reject it and accept responsibility for the military confrontation that would inevitably follow. President Roosevelt and Secretary Hull understood they were being maneuvered into a lose-lose situation. They suspected that Japanese proposals were crafted more to justify future Japanese actions than to achieve genuine diplomatic settlement. They knew Japan was using ongoing negotiations to buy time for military preparation. But they also knew that rejecting Japanese diplomacy would provide Japan with the justification they wanted to begin military operations throughout the Pacific. American rejection would be used as propaganda to legitimize Japanese attacks on American, British, and Dutch territories. This created a strategic trap that Japan had constructed deliberately. America would be blamed for choosing war, regardless of what America actually decided. If America accepted Japanese terms, Japan would achieve their strategic objectives without fighting. If America rejected Japanese terms, Japan would pursue their objectives through fighting, while claiming America had made peaceful resolution impossible. American officials spent precious weeks in November 1941 debating how to respond to proposals they suspected were fundamentally designed to be unacceptable to American interests. Meanwhile, Japanese forces were moving into final positions for coordinated attacks throughout the Pacific region. The time America spent seeking diplomatic solutions was time Japan used to perfect military solutions. Every day America delayed military confrontation was another day Japan gained to prepare for military confrontation. Every effort America made to avoid immediate conflict was another advantage Japan gained when conflict became inevitable. Japan had transformed American diplomatic procedures into Japanese strategic advantages. But Japan's diplomatic maneuvering also reflected their own impossible strategic situation. By November 1941, American economic sanctions had given Japan two unacceptable choices: abandon their empire in China or seize oil resources in Southeast Asia to continue their expansion. Abandoning China meant admitting that 4 years of warfare and hundreds of thousands of casualties had achieved nothing permanent. It meant political catastrophe for Japan's military-dominated government and the collapse of everything they had fought to achieve since 1937. Seizing Southeast Asian oil meant war with Britain, the Netherlands, and almost certainly the United States. It meant fighting enemies with superior industrial capacity and global reach, while Japan's own resources were already strained from the prolonged China conflict. Neither option offered Japan a satisfactory long-term outcome, so they chose a third option: strike first with maximum shock and hope to force their enemies to negotiate a favorable settlement before superior Allied industrial capacity could be fully mobilized against Japan. Pearl Harbor was never intended to lead to Japanese conquest of the United States. It was intended to shock America into accepting Japanese conquest of Asia. Japan hoped that devastating surprise attacks would convince Americans that fighting Japan would be too costly and dangerous to sustain over years of global warfare. The diplomatic negotiations served this strategy perfectly. They convinced Americans that Japan might still choose negotiated settlement, while Japan prepared for the military operations that would supposedly make settlement inevitable. Japan's final offer was really a final ultimatum: accept our terms voluntarily or face the consequences of forcing us to impose them militarily. When America refused, Japan could claim they had been compelled to use military solutions because diplomatic solutions had failed through American intransigence. The chronology of Japanese diplomacy and military preparation reveals the extent of their coordinated strategy. Late November 20th through 26th, Japan presents final proposals for negotiated settlement in Washington while completing fleet preparations. About November 26th, the Kido Butai sortied from northern home waters bound for Hawaii. Late November 26th through 27th, America rejects Japanese proposal and presents counter-demands for complete Japanese withdrawal from conquered territories. December 2nd, Tokyo sent the coded order Niitakayama Nobo, climb Mount Niitaka, the go signal that confirmed the operation's schedule. December 7th, Pearl Harbor attack begins at 7:48 a.m. local time. December 7th, Tokyo's long diplomatic message was not presented to Washington before the assault due to transcription and timing delays. Parts of it reached U.S. officials only after the attacks began, a fact that intensified international condemnation. This sequence demonstrates that Japan was completing military preparations while conducting diplomatic negotiations, positioning forces while discussing peaceful terms, and launching attacks while maintaining the pretense of seeking negotiated solutions. Most revealing is the timing of Japan's formal diplomatic notification. The delayed notification meant Americans experienced hours of devastating attack before understanding the full scope of Japanese intentions. American leaders wasted precious time wondering whether the attacks represented authorized government policy or some kind of unauthorized military action. The late delivery added deliberate insult to massive injury. It demonstrated that Japan had never intended to follow standard diplomatic procedures regarding the initiation of hostilities, whether through deliberate deception or calculated indifference to diplomatic norms. President Roosevelt was justified in calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy. The infamy wasn't just the surprise attack itself, it was the months of diplomatic discussions that had made such complete surprise possible. Japan's strategy of using diplomatic negotiations to facilitate military operations has become a recurring pattern in international relations throughout the modern era. Similar approaches can be observed in other historical cases, where nations conduct negotiations while preparing military actions, using diplomatic engagement to buy time for strategic positioning, and claiming diplomatic failure justifies military solutions. The fundamental approach never changes. Create diplomatic frameworks that serve strategic objectives. Whether the diplomacy succeeds or fails, then use the failure of diplomacy to justify the military actions that diplomacy was designed to enable or facilitate. Democratic societies remain vulnerable to this strategy because democratic governance requires faith that reasonable people can find reasonable compromises through reasonable discussions. When adversaries exploit that faith, democratic responses often become inadequate until it's too late for effective diplomatic solutions and too early for effective military responses. Japan proved that determined adversaries will use their opponent's commitment to diplomatic processes as weapons against their opponent's security interests. They transformed American faith in negotiated solutions into a tool for preventing American preparation for military solutions. They used American hope for peaceful resolution to make American readiness for violent resolution nearly impossible. And when the bombs started falling on Pearl Harbor, they claimed America had forced them to attack by refusing to accept reasonable Japanese demands for regional hegemony. Whether through deliberate deception or calculated diplomatic strategy, Japan's approach had achieved its primary objective. America entered the war shocked, unprepared, and strategically surprised. The months of diplomatic theatre had successfully disguised the final preparations for military catastrophe. December 7th was the day America learned that some enemies will negotiate while they prepare to attack, smile while they plan destruction, and blame their victims for forcing them to use violence. It was a lesson that would reshape American approaches to international diplomacy for generations. And hopefully, a lesson that will never need to be learned again. November 26, 1941. In the cold grey waters of Tankan Bay in the remote Kuril Islands, the most powerful naval strike force in history slips its moorings and heads into the North Pacific. 6 aircraft carriers, over 400 warplanes, dozens of escorts and support vessels carrying roughly tens of thousands of personnel. Their destination, Pearl Harbor, several thousand miles across the North Pacific, roughly 3,000 to 3,500 miles, depending on measured course. Their mission: achieve complete tactical surprise against the most powerful navy on Earth. Their challenge: cross half the Pacific Ocean without being detected by a single American patrol plane, submarine, or merchant vessel. If they were spotted, surprise would be at grave risk. Detection could have forced an abort or catastrophic losses, and the operation's strategic rationale would have evaporated. This is the story of the most dangerous gamble in military history, and how Japan almost lost everything by betting it all on 12 days of perfect invisibility. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded a force that defied conventional naval wisdom. By every measure of traditional naval strategy, concentrating 6 fleet carriers in a single task force was extraordinarily dangerous. Carriers were supposed to operate independently or in pairs, not bunched together like a single massive target. Concentrating so much carrier power in one strike was extraordinarily risky and broke with more cautious dispersal doctrines. But Yamamoto had calculated that only overwhelming force could guarantee success at Pearl Harbor. Anything less than total carrier aviation superiority would give American defenders time to organize effective resistance. Half measures would produce half results, and half results meant strategic failure. So Japan committed a majority of Japan's carrier striking power to a single operation. The 6 carriers, Akagi, Keiga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, represented the cutting edge of naval aviation technology. Together they embarked over 400 aircraft, Zero fighters, Val dive bombers, and Kate torpedo bombers. Each plane was flown by pilots with hundreds of hours of training and combat experience from the war in China. Supporting the carriers were fast battleships, heavy cruisers, destroyers, and fleet tankers for refueling at sea. Submarines had already departed to scout American defenses and patrol potential escape routes. Midget submarines were positioned to infiltrate Pearl Harbor during the attack. This wasn't just a naval task force. It was a floating military empire capable of projecting devastating air power anywhere in the Pacific. But concentrating so much firepower in one place also concentrated all of Japan's strategic risk in one place. If the Americans discovered and destroyed this fleet, Japan would lose the Pacific War in a single battle. Nagumo understood the mathematics of his situation perfectly. He commanded either Japan's greatest strategic asset or Japan's most catastrophic liability. Which it became depended entirely on the next 12 days. Yamamoto's route selection was as brilliant as it was dangerous. The obvious approach to Hawaii would have been through the Central Pacific, following established shipping lanes where Japanese merchant vessels routinely traveled. This route offered better weather, easier navigation, and familiar waters. It also guaranteed detection by American patrols and immediate strategic failure. Instead, Yamamoto chose the northern route through some of the most hostile waters on Earth. The Kido Butai would steam northeast toward the Aleutian Islands, then turn southeast toward Hawaii, approaching from the north where American defenses were weakest. This route had multiple advantages. American patrol planes rarely flew the northern approaches because of harsh weather and distance from bases. American merchant shipping avoided the area because of storms and rough seas. American submarines concentrated on southern and western approaches where they expected Japanese forces to appear. But the northern route also presented enormous challenges. November and December brought the worst weather of the year to the North Pacific. Storms could scatter the fleet, delay refueling operations, or damage aircraft. Navigation would be extremely difficult without radio communication or celestial observations through cloud cover. Most dangerously, the northern route required precise timing that allowed no margin for error. The fleet had to maintain exact speed and heading to reach launch position at exactly the right time. Too early, and they would be spotted by American dawn patrols. Too late, and they would miss the opportunity for surprise attack. Yamamoto was gambling that Mother Nature would cooperate with Japanese strategy better than she cooperated with American surveillance. It was a bet that could have destroyed Japan before the first shot was fired. Complete radio silence was absolutely essential to Japanese success, and absolutely terrifying to Japanese commanders. Modern military operations depend on constant communication between units, headquarters, and supporting forces. Commanders need regular updates on weather, navigation, enemy movements, and operational changes. Ships need coordination for formation changes, refueling operations, and emergency responses. But a single radio transmission from the Kido Butai would pinpoint their location for American radio intercept stations throughout the Pacific. American triangulation could determine Japanese course, speed, and probable destination within hours. The element of surprise would be lost forever. So, strict radio silence was maintained for the fleet's multi-day transit, a self-imposed communications blackout that magnified both concealment and danger. No weather reports, no position updates, no emergency communications. If ships became separated, they were on their own. If emergencies arose, they had to solve them without outside help. The psychological pressure was enormous. Every commander knew that Japanese forces throughout the Pacific were moving into position for coordinated attacks. If the Pearl Harbor operation was cancelled or delayed, dozens of other operations would fail because of poor coordination. But they had no way of knowing whether the overall strategic situation had changed. American forces might have detected other Japanese preparations and raised alert levels throughout the Pacific. Diplomatic negotiations might have achieved breakthrough success, making military attack politically impossible. Nagumo's commanders lived in an information vacuum that grew more dangerous with every passing day. They were committed to an operation they couldn't abort, heading toward a target they couldn't verify, following a plan they couldn't modify. Radio silence that was essential for tactical success created strategic blindness that could prove catastrophic. The North Pacific in late November 1941 was simultaneously Japan's greatest ally and greatest enemy. Massive storm systems provided perfect cover for the advancing fleet. Low clouds and heavy precipitation made air reconnaissance impossible over thousands of square miles of ocean. High winds and rough seas kept American patrol planes grounded at bases throughout Alaska and the Aleutians. But the same weather systems that hid the Japanese fleet also threatened to destroy it. Mountainous waves crashed over carrier flight decks, damaging aircraft and equipment. Destroyer escorts rode the swells like surfboards, disappearing completely between wave crests. Fleet tankers struggled to maintain formation, while transferring fuel in conditions that would challenge peacetime operations. Navigation became a nightmare of dead reckoning and educated guesswork. Celestial navigation was impossible through solid cloud cover. Radio navigation was forbidden because of silence requirements. Ships had to maintain course and speed based on compass headings and estimated distances, with no way to verify their actual positions. The margin for error was essentially zero. If the fleet arrived at launch position too far north, their aircraft wouldn't have enough fuel to reach Pearl Harbor. Too far south, and American patrol planes would detect them before they could launch. Too far east or west, and they would miss their target window entirely. Japanese navigators were betting their navigation skills against some of the most challenging weather conditions on Earth. A single miscalculation would doom the entire operation. Weather that provided perfect concealment also provided perfect opportunities for perfect disaster. For 12 days, the Kido Butai balanced on the knife's edge between success and catastrophe. Some accounts record potential close calls, for example, sightings by neutral or merchant vessels that could have compromised the task force. In those instances, the fleet's speed, weather, and luck combined to avoid detection. Japanese lookouts reported nearby merchant ships and observed activity. These sightings did not result in detection by Allied forces. Either they didn't recognize the fleet as Japanese, or international intelligence cooperation wasn't as efficient as feared. American patrols were reportedly in the area, but did not detect the fleet. Weather and cloud cover were likely significant factors. The fleet took evasive action when aircraft appeared, scattering into storm clouds while refueling operations were emergency halted. Japanese submarine scouts reported increased American patrol activity around Hawaii. American forces might be aware that something unusual was happening, even if they didn't know exactly what. Japanese radio intelligence intercepts suggested higher American alert levels throughout the Pacific. But there was no way for Nagumo to communicate these concerns to Tokyo or receive updated orders. The fleet was committed to continuing, regardless of changing circumstances. Radio silence that protected the operation also prevented adaptation to new intelligence. Each reported close call reinforced the same terrifying reality. Japanese success depended on American oversight, not Japanese superiority. If American forces had been slightly more alert, slightly more thorough, or slightly more lucky, the entire operation could have failed. Japan was gambling their entire strategic future on American mistakes. December 6th brought Nagumo's worst nightmare. Intelligence reports that American aircraft carriers were not at Pearl Harbor. The entire Pearl Harbor operation was designed around destroying American carrier aviation before it could be used against Japanese expansion throughout the Pacific. Battleships were impressive, but essentially secondary to modern naval warfare. Carriers were the real threat to Japanese strategic objectives. Enterprise was delivering aircraft to Wake Island and wouldn't return until December 8th. Lexington was ferrying planes to Midway and was hundreds of miles from Hawaiian waters. Saratoga was undergoing repairs in San Diego and couldn't participate in Pacific operations for weeks. Japanese intelligence had predicted that all three carriers would be at Pearl Harbor on Sunday morning, December 7th. Sunday was typically a rest day when major ships remained in port. Previous surveillance had shown consistent patterns of weekend carrier presence. But American operational requirements had disrupted Japanese assumptions. The carriers were exactly where they needed to be for American defensive purposes, and exactly where they couldn't be destroyed by Japanese offensive operations. Nagumo faced a terrible strategic dilemma with no good options. He could abort the operation and return to Japan with his primary mission unfulfilled. He could proceed with the attack and accept that strategic objectives would only be partially achieved. He could search for the missing carriers and risk detection by American forces. Radio silence prevented consultation with Tokyo about this fundamental change in strategic circumstances. Nagumo had to make the most important decision in Japanese naval history based entirely on his own judgment. He chose to proceed with an attack that would yield significant tactical damage even if it failed to destroy the carriers the plan had ideally targeted. Destroying Pearl Harbor's infrastructure and battleship fleet would still provide considerable tactical advantages, even without eliminating American carrier aviation. It was a reasonable decision that would ultimately prove strategically insufficient. The carriers that escaped destruction on December 7th would provide the foundation for American victory at Midway 6 months later. December 6th, 2300 hours. Approximately 230 miles north of Oahu, the Kido Butai reaches launch position after 12 days of perfect invisibility. Nagumo orders the fleet to turn southeast toward Pearl Harbor and increase speed to launch velocity. Flight deck crews begin final preparations for the largest carrier aviation attack in military history. Pilots receive final briefings on targets, approach routes, and escape procedures. The weather is clearing rapidly. Cloud cover that concealed the fleet's approach now threatens to expose the attack force to American observation. Dawn will bring perfect visibility for both Japanese bombers and American defenders. American patrol planes will begin flying routine dawn reconnaissance missions in less than 6 hours. If the Japanese fleet is detected now, American forces will have time to organize effective resistance. The element of complete surprise will be compromised. But Japanese aircraft need good weather to navigate accurately to their targets and return safely to their carriers. Perfect concealment and perfect attack conditions are mutually exclusive. Nagumo must choose between continuing to hide and beginning to fight. December 7th, 05:30 hours. Nagumo makes his final decision. The first wave of Japanese aircraft begins launching from carrier decks. 183 planes rise into the pre-dawn darkness, carrying the hopes and fears of the Japanese Empire toward their sleeping enemy. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida leads the formation toward Pearl Harbor, navigating by dead reckoning and radio beacon signals from Hawaiian commercial stations. The carriers turn into the wind to maintain launch operations while destroyer escorts form protective screens around the task force. Combat air patrols circle overhead to prevent surprise attacks by American submarines or patrol planes. The fleet is now fully committed to battle. 12 days of perfect invisibility are about to become 2 hours of devastating visibility. Everything Japan had worked for since the Meiji Restoration 50 years earlier now depended on the skill of pilots who were barely visible specks, disappearing into the southern horizon. The invisible armada had carried Japan's destiny across 3,000 miles of hostile ocean. Now, that destiny would be decided by young men flying toward an enemy who didn't know they were coming. In 90 minutes, the world would discover whether Japan had achieved the impossible or attempted the unthinkable. Either way, nothing would ever be the same again. Approximately 7:02 a.m., December 7th, 1941. Private George Elliott Jr. stares at his oscilloscope screen in disbelief. The radar return is massive, larger than anything he's ever seen during months of training on the primitive SCR-270 radar set. "Hey, this is the largest group I've ever seen on the scope," he tells his partner, Private Joseph Lockhart. The two young soldiers are manning the remote Opana radar station on Oahu's north shore, scheduled to shut down operations at 7 a.m. But the size of this contact is so unusual that Lockhart decides to keep tracking it. The blip on their screen corresponded to what was later identified as the first wave, roughly 183 Japanese aircraft approaching Hawaii. In 46 minutes, those aircraft will begin the most devastating surprise attack in American military history. But right now, 2 American soldiers have detected the enemy formation and are trying desperately to warn someone, anyone, who will listen. Nobody believes them. Human beings are remarkably bad at recognizing existential threats. Not because we're stupid, but because we're wired for survival in a world where most unusual events are harmless anomalies rather than life-threatening disasters. This cognitive bias, called normalcy bias by psychologists, helps us function in daily life without being paralyzed by constant fear. When something unusual happens, our brains automatically search for normal explanations rather than catastrophic ones. Most of the time, this mental shortcut saves us from wasting energy on false alarms. But sometimes, the impossible threat is real. And when it is, normalcy bias becomes deadly. At approximately 7:05 a.m., Lockhart calls the Aircraft Warning Service at Fort Shafter to report the massive radar return. The operator connects him to Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, the duty officer responsible for evaluating unusual contacts. Tyler has been on duty since 4 a.m. He's tired, bored, and expecting nothing more eventful than routine morning patrols by American aircraft. When Lockhart describes the large formation approaching from the north, Tyler's brain immediately searches for normal explanations. Tyler, expecting friendly B-17s, downplayed the contact, a response later described as assuming a routine arrival rather than an alarm. He knows that a flight of B-17 Flying Fortress bombers is expected to arrive from California sometime this morning. A large radar return from the north must be those friendly aircraft. Tyler's reasoning is logical, rational, and completely wrong. The B-17s are approaching from the northeast in a small formation. The Japanese attack force is approaching from the north in a massive formation. But Tyler's mind has found a comfortable explanation that requires no action, no alarm, and no disruption of normal routine. 183 enemy aircraft become some B-17s from California. The largest air attack in Pacific history becomes a routine training flight. Normalcy bias transforms obvious danger into comfortable assumptions. But the radar contact wasn't the only warning American forces received that morning. At approximately 6:37 a.m., 25 minutes before the radar detection, the destroyer USS Ward had fired the first shots of the Pacific War. Lieutenant Commander William Outerbridge was commanding Ward on his first patrol duty when lookouts spotted a periscope following the supply ship Antares toward the entrance of Pearl Harbor. A submarine in that location could only be hostile, American submarines were strictly forbidden from operating in those waters without special authorization. Ward immediately went to general quarters and moved to intercept. At approximately 6:45 a.m., the destroyer opened fire on the submarine with its 4-inch guns, scoring a direct hit. Ward then dropped depth charges and reported seeing debris and oil slicks on the water surface. Outerbridge immediately transmitted a message to 14th Naval District Headquarters, reporting the attack on an unidentified submarine in restricted waters. This wasn't an ambiguous radar contact that could be explained away. This was an actual attack by American forces on a hostile submarine in Pearl Harbor's defensive zone. It should have triggered immediate fleet-wide alerts and defensive preparations throughout Pearl Harbor. Instead, it triggered bureaucratic delays and demands for verification. Ward's report reached 14th Naval District Headquarters and was treated cautiously. Staff sought confirmation and followed verification procedures that consumed critical minutes. Nobody wanted to sound a false alarm based on a single destroyer's report of hostile submarine activity. By the time Admiral Husband Kimmel received word of Ward's action, Japanese aircraft were already approaching Pearl Harbor's outer defenses. The warning that should have provided an hour of preparation time instead provided none. American military leaders had received definitive proof of hostile Japanese activity in Hawaiian waters. Their response was to ask for more proof instead of preparing for attack. Bureaucratic caution transformed obvious enemy action into administrative paperwork. What happened at Pearl Harbor that morning wasn't unique to December 7th, 1941. It represents a universal human pattern that appears whenever people receive warnings about threats they don't expect and don't want to believe. The pattern always follows the same sequence. First, people receive clear evidence of approaching danger. Second, they search for normal explanations that don't require immediate action. Third, they demand additional confirmation before accepting that the threat is real. Fourth, they delay response while seeking verification. Fifth, the threat materializes while they're still processing the warnings. This pattern appears throughout history with devastating consistency. September 11th, 2001. FBI field officers report suspicious activities by foreign nationals taking flight training but showing no interest in learning to land aircraft. Headquarters dismisses these reports as coincidental and unrelated. Normal explanations are preferred over terrorist conspiracy theories. COVID-19 pandemic. Intelligence agencies report viral outbreaks in Wuhan with human-to-human transmission potential. Public health officials insist the risk to Americans remains low. Normal seasonal illness patterns are assumed rather than global pandemic scenarios. The specific threats change, but the human response remains identical. People consistently choose comfortable assumptions over uncomfortable realities until reality forces acknowledgement through catastrophic consequences. Pearl Harbor reflected not only intelligence and analytic shortcomings, but also human and organizational failures, psychological biases, procedural inertia, and divided command that delayed decisive action. Pearl Harbor also revealed how organizational structures can transform individual awareness into collective blindness. Both the radar operators and the destroyer crew correctly identified hostile threats and attempted to report them through proper channels. The failure occurred in the chain of communication between field personnel who saw the danger and command personnel who needed to act on it. Private Lockhart understood that his radar contact was unprecedented and potentially threatening. But He had no direct communication with Admiral Kimmel or any other decision-making authority. His warning had to pass through multiple layers of command, each creating opportunities for delay, misinterpretation, or dismissal. Lieutenant Commander Outerbridge knew that his submarine attack represented probable enemy action requiring immediate fleet response. But his messages had to be analysed and verified by staff officers before reaching operational commanders. Each step in the process consumed precious time while adding psychological distance from the original event. By the time field observations reached decision-makers, they had been filtered through organizational bureaucracy that prioritized process over urgency. Clear warnings became ambiguous reports. Immediate threats became administrative questions. Modern military organizations study Pearl Harbor as a classic example of communication failure during crisis situations. The people closest to the threat had the clearest understanding of danger. The people furthest from the threat had the authority to respond to danger. The organizational structure connecting them was optimized for routine operations, not emergency response. This structural problem persists in every large organization facing unexpected threats. People who detect problems rarely have authority to solve them. People who have authority to solve problems rarely receive unfiltered information about them. The larger and more complex the organization, the greater the distance between threat detection and threat response. Pearl Harbor demonstrated how that distance can become fatal when measured in minutes rather than days. Perhaps most significantly, Pearl Harbor revealed the dangers of divided command during crisis situations. No single person was responsible for defending Oahu from enemy attack. Admiral Kimmel commanded naval forces. General Walter Short commanded army forces. Neither had authority over the other, and both reported to different chains of command in Washington. This division of responsibility created coordination problems that persisted throughout the final hours before the attack. Navy radar operators reported to Army command centers. Army aircraft were responsible for long-range reconnaissance missions. Naval vessels provided harbor defense, while Army units provided anti-aircraft protection. When warning signals appeared, there was no single authority responsible for evaluating them and ordering appropriate responses. Each service processed information according to its own procedures and priorities. Coordination required consultation and consensus rather than immediate decision-making. Lieutenant Tyler dismissed the radar contact as friendly aircraft because he was thinking like an Army officer concerned with airbase operations. Admiral Kimmel demanded verification of the submarine attack because he was thinking like a naval commander concerned with false alarms. Neither was thinking like an overall defense commander responsible for protecting Pearl Harbor from coordinated enemy attack. Because there was no overall defense commander. Pearl Harbor paid the price for organizational politics that prioritized service autonomy over operational effectiveness. The attack succeeded partly because American defenders couldn't coordinate their response fast enough to counter Japanese coordination of their attack. Approximately 7:39 a.m. Radar operator Private Elliott continues tracking the massive formation as it approaches Oahu. The contact is now so close that he can see individual aircraft groups separating from the main formation. Reports indicate he tried contacting the aircraft warning service again, but was told that Lieutenant Tyler had already evaluated the contact and determined it wasn't threatening. Approximately 7:48 a.m., the first Japanese bombs fall on Ford Island in the center of Pearl Harbor. Private Elliott shuts down his radar equipment and listens to explosions echoing across Oahu. The impossible threat he detected 46 minutes earlier has become devastating reality. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Tyler is driving to breakfast when he hears the attack beginning. He immediately realizes that the radar contact he dismissed must have been the Japanese attack formation. His comfortable assumption about friendly B-17s has become one of the most consequential mistakes in American military history. Lieutenant Commander Outerbridge, still on patrol in Ward, watches Japanese aircraft streaming overhead toward Pearl Harbor and realizes that his submarine attack had been the opening engagement of the Pacific War. The verification that headquarters demanded has arrived in the form of several hundred enemy aircraft. The warnings that nobody believed have been validated by catastrophic consequences. But validation comes too late to prevent disaster. By the time American leaders accept that impossible threats can be real, the impossible has already happened. Pearl Harbor taught America that the deadliest enemies are often the ones we refuse to see coming. Not because the warnings aren't there, but because our minds are wired to explain them away until explanation becomes impossible. And by then, it's too late to do anything except count the casualties and promise it will never happen again. Until the next time, nobody believes the warnings. 8:06 a.m., December 7th, 1941. A seaman is writing a letter to his girlfriend in the forward crew compartment of the USS Arizona. "It's so peaceful here," the letter reads. "Nothing ever happens in this place. It's a great life if you don't weaken." In the ship's bakery, a young sailor is preparing fresh bread for Sunday breakfast. On the bridge, an ensign is reviewing the ship's daily schedule. In the engine rooms below, dozens of sailors are monitoring gauges and maintaining the massive boilers that power America's most famous battleship. Above them, a Japanese bomber released a large armor-piercing projectile that penetrated decks and continued downward toward Arizona's forward magazines. Exact ammunition type and release altitude are variously reported in different accounts. At 8:06 and 10 seconds a.m., the bomb strikes the ship between turrets 1 and 2. Moments later, 1,177 American sailors are dead. The USS Arizona doesn't just sink. It becomes the site of the most catastrophic naval explosion in American history. This is the story of those crucial seconds that changed everything. This wasn't just a warship. It was a floating city of roughly 1,500 men who had transformed 31,000 tons of steel into a living, breathing community. The Arizona had been their home for months or years. They knew every compartment, every ladder, every shortcut through the maze of passages. They had movie nights in the crew mess, boxing matches on the fantail, and ice cream socials on deck. They wrote letters to sweethearts, played cards for pennies, and complained about Navy food while secretly loving the camaraderie. Most were teenagers or men in their early 20s. Farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit who had joined the Navy to see the world. They maintained the ship's electrical systems, operated its massive guns, and kept its engines running 24 hours a day. On Sunday morning, most were looking forward to shore leave in Honolulu. Some had dates planned, others wanted to visit the beach or catch a movie. Within moments, their floating city would become their tomb. 8:06 and 10 seconds. The armor-piercing projectile strikes the Arizona's deck with tremendous force. The bomb doesn't explode on impact. It's designed to penetrate deep into the ship before detonating, maximizing damage to internal structures. The armor-piercing design allows it to punch through the Arizona's deck plating. At the moment of impact, most of the crew feels nothing more than a sharp vibration that could be anything. Another ship bumping the dock, equipment being dropped, or routine maintenance work. Sailors look up from their tasks momentarily, then continue with their routines. The bomb has entered the ship, but its real work hasn't begun yet. In the Arizona's forward magazines, over 1,000 tons of black powder and high explosives wait in storage compartments designed to be the safest spaces on the ship. Multiple layers of armor protect the magazines from enemy fire. Flooding systems can instantly fill the compartments with water if fire threatens the explosives. But all of these safety systems are designed to protect against conventional threats. None of them can stop an armor-piercing bomb that has already penetrated multiple decks and is continuing downward toward the heart of the ship. For most of the Arizona's crew, this is the last moment of normal life they will ever experience. The bomb continues its downward trajectory through the Arizona's interior spaces. Now the crew begins to notice that something is seriously wrong. The sound of rending metal echoes through compartments as the bomb smashes through internal structures. Sailors look up from their tasks with growing alarm. In the forward crew quarters, men who were sleeping are jolted awake. Some grab life jackets out of instinct. Others rush toward their general quarters stations. Most are still trying to figure out what's happening. The bomb has now penetrated deep enough to threaten the Arizona's most critical systems. It's moving through spaces containing electrical cables, steam pipes, and fuel lines. The bomb continues downward, driven by momentum toward the one location that could turn a serious attack into an absolute catastrophe. The seaman drops his pencil and starts to stand up. The baker turns toward the sound of breaking metal. The ensign reaches for the ship's intercom to sound general quarters. None of them will complete these actions. The bomb is now approaching the forward magazine, where hundreds of tons of explosives wait in carefully organized storage racks. Black powder charges for the ship's 14-inch guns. High explosive shells ready for loading. Smokeless powder in waterproof containers. All of it stable and safe under normal conditions. All of it devastating and lethal if detonated simultaneously. The armor-piercing bomb reaches the forward magazine and explodes. The magazine detonation released a titanic amount of energy. Instruments around Oahu registered a powerful shock, and the blast was felt throughout the harbor and beyond. Contemporary observers described it as like an earthquake. This is the moment when individual tragedy becomes mass catastrophe. The magazine detonation killed hundreds instantly. Many bodies were obliterated or rendered unrecoverable by blast, fire, and collapsing structure. The forward sections were consumed in a catastrophic, near-instantaneous conflagration. The magazine explosion creates a blast wave that travels through the Arizona's hull with devastating effect. Compartments that took months to construct are obliterated in seconds. Steel bulkheads designed to withstand enemy shellfire are shredded. The Arizona's forward magazines, crew quarters, and operational spaces are reduced to superheated debris. The initial blast creates a pressure wave that propagates throughout the entire ship, seeking release through any available opening. Hatches blow off their hinges. Portholes shatter. Ventilation systems become conduits for flames and shrapnel. Within these crucial moments, the USS Arizona ceases to exist as a functional warship and becomes something unprecedented, a floating explosion. The explosion reaches the Arizona's main deck and erupts skyward in a pillar of fire, smoke, and debris that rises over 1,000 feet into the air. Witnesses on nearby ships describe the Arizona as literally lifting out of the water. The entire forward section of the battleship, over 200 feet of steel weighing thousands of tons, is blown upward by the force of the magazine explosion. For a few seconds, the Arizona's bow appears to be flying. A mushroom cloud of black smoke, mixed with orange flames, towers above Pearl Harbor. Heavy debris was hurled hundreds of yards and fell on nearby vessels and Ford Island. Pieces of the Arizona land on other ships throughout Pearl Harbor. The battleship Tennessee, moored alongside Arizona, is pelted with metal fragments. Ford Island's airfield is showered with pieces of the destroyed ship. Arizona debris reaches ships over 500 yards away. But the most shocking aspect isn't the physical destruction, it's the speed. Sailors on nearby vessels watch in horror as an entire battleship disappears in moments. One instant, the Arizona is there, massive and seemingly indestructible. The next instant, it's a pillar of fire reaching toward the sky. The explosion creates its own localized weather effects. The superheated gases rising from the Arizona create wind patterns that affect aircraft flying overhead. Photographers capture images of the explosion that will become some of the most famous pictures in military history. But no photograph can convey the sound, a roar so loud that it drowns out gunfire from every other ship in the harbor. Gravity reasserts itself, and what remains of the Arizona crashes back down into Pearl Harbor. The forward section of the ship, blown skyward by the magazine explosion, falls back into the water in pieces. Some chunks of steel are so large they create their own splash patterns. Others fall like metallic rain across the harbor. The middle section of the Arizona, damaged beyond repair but not completely destroyed, begins settling toward the harbor bottom. Massive amounts of water rush into the spaces where the forward magazines used to be. The ship's structural integrity has been completely compromised. What's left of the Arizona is no longer a ship in any meaningful sense. It's a collection of twisted metal, burning fuel, and flooded compartments, slowly sinking into 40 feet of harbor water. The stern section remains relatively intact, but it's trapped by the wreckage. In the water around the Arizona, oil from ruptured fuel tanks creates a spreading fire that will burn for days. Thick, black smoke pours from the wreckage, carrying the smell of burning fuel, hot metal, and death across Pearl Harbor. Incredibly, some men in the Arizona's stern sections are still alive. They are trapped in compartments that are flooding rapidly, with no way to reach topside through the twisted wreckage. Some bang on bulkheads, hoping someone will hear them. Others try to find alternate escape routes through spaces they can barely see. A few succeed in reaching the surface and are pulled from the water by rescue boats. Most do not. They become part of the Arizona's final casualty count, men who survived the explosion only to drown in the wreckage of their own ship. An eerie quiet settles over the Arizona's wreckage. This silence is more disturbing than the explosion itself. Survivors on nearby ships describe it as unnatural and terrifying. One moment, the harbor echoes with the roar of the magazine blast. The next moment, there's an almost complete absence of sound from the Arizona's location. The silence represents the absence of 1,177 voices that will never speak again. No calls for help from the forward sections because there's no one left alive to call. No sound of machinery because all the machinery has been destroyed. No voices from the crew, because most of the crew no longer exists. What few sounds remain are heartbreaking. Occasional weak calls from men trapped in the stern. The hiss of steam escaping from ruptured pipes. The crackle of fires still burning. The lap of oil-covered water against twisted metal. On ships throughout Pearl Harbor, sailors stand in shocked silence, trying to comprehend what they've just witnessed. Many are crying. Others are vomiting from shock and horror. Some are praying. A few are already manning guns, ready to fight back. Most are simply staring at the place where the Arizona used to be, unable to process the reality that an entire battleship and most of its crew have been eliminated in moments. The Arizona explosion was so sudden and complete that observers' minds simply shut down temporarily. Americans throughout Pearl Harbor begin responding to the Arizona disaster with courage that defies rational explanation. Sailors from other ships dive into burning, oil-covered water to search for Arizona survivors. They know the water is toxic and the fires could spread to engulf them. They search anyway, because that's what shipmates do for each other. Motor launches and small boats converge on the Arizona wreckage from every direction. Coxswains navigate through floating debris, burning oil, and potential secondary explosions to look for signs of life. They pull a few injured survivors from the water, but find mostly debris and death. On nearby ships, damage control teams work frantically to prevent the Arizona's fate from spreading to other vessels. They fight oil fires, clear debris from their own decks, and prepare for additional attacks while still processing the shock. When faced with catastrophe beyond comprehension, most people don't freeze or panic. They default to training, duty, and concern for others. Medical personnel throughout Pearl Harbor prepare for casualties, even though they suspect there may be very few survivors to treat. They set up aid stations and organize stretcher teams. When it becomes clear that most Arizona casualties are beyond medical help, they redirect their efforts to other damaged ships. No one had planned for the complete destruction of a major warship in moments. But everyone begins improvising solutions to problems they've never faced before. Minutes after the bomb impact, the USS Arizona's destruction is complete. What remains is a smoking, partially submerged wreck that bears little resemblance to the mighty battleship that had been the pride of the Pacific Fleet moments earlier. The forward 2/3 of the ship has been obliterated. The stern section sits at an odd angle, settling slowly into the harbour mud. Oil fires continue burning on the water surface, fed by thousands of gallons of fuel oil escaping from ruptured tanks. The fires will burn for 3 days, creating a pillar of black smoke visible from anywhere on Oahu. Of roughly 1,500 men aboard Arizona that morning, about 1,177 died and around 335 survived. Many of those killed were never recovered and remain entombed within the wreck. Most survivors are men who were on deck or in the stern sections when the magazine exploded. Many bodies are never recovered, trapped in compartments that are now sealed beneath tons of twisted metal. The Arizona becomes their tomb. Japan hasn't just sunk a battleship. They've eliminated a symbol of American naval power and created a rallying cry that will motivate American war efforts for years to come. The destruction of Arizona became a powerful rallying symbol. Remember Pearl Harbor, and the ship's memory galvanized American resolve. The ship's destruction provides Americans with a personal, emotional connection to the war. Rescue workers continue searching the wreckage for survivors, even though they know their chances are rapidly diminishing. They search because hope is the only alternative to despair. Forensic and historical analyses confirm the detonation's suddenness and power. The blast propagated through the ship with catastrophic effect, throwing heavy debris long distances and killing large numbers instantly or rendering remains unrecoverable. Many survivors later testified that those in the forward spaces had virtually no warning. The magazine detonation created tremendous heat and pressure that melted steel and made recovery of many remains impossible. The blast was powerful enough to be felt on ships miles away and registered on instruments designed to measure seismic activity. Analysis shows that pieces of the Arizona were scattered across a wide area of Pearl Harbor. Some fragments traveled extraordinary distances before crashing back to Earth. Modern analysis confirms that the Arizona's destruction was essentially instantaneous from the crew's perspective. Men in the forward sections died so quickly that they probably never realized they were under attack. Death came faster than human nervous systems could process pain or fear. This understanding provides some comfort to families of Arizona casualties. Their loved ones didn't suffer. They didn't have time to be afraid. They were simply there one moment and gone the next. Today, the USS Arizona rests on the bottom of Pearl Harbor, exactly where it sank on December 7, 1941. The ship has become a permanent memorial to the 1,177 men who died in its destruction. Oil still seeps from the Arizona's fuel tanks, creating rainbow slicks that visitors call the Tears of the Arizona. Engineers estimate that the ship contains enough fuel oil to continue leaking for several more decades. The memorial, built over the Arizona's hull, attracts over 2 million visitors annually. They come to honor the dead, to understand history, and to witness the place where America's innocents died in moments. But the real memorial isn't the building constructed above the wreck. It's the wreck itself, a tomb containing the remains of men who were killed so quickly they became part of their ship forever. The Arizona explosion changed how Americans think about war, death, and national security. It proved that distance and technology cannot protect against determined enemies. It demonstrated that modern warfare can destroy entire communities in seconds rather than months. Most importantly, the Arizona reminds us that behind every historical event are individual human beings, with names, families, dreams, and fears. The seaman never finished his letter. The baker never served his fresh bread. The ensign never sounded general quarters. They became part of something larger than themselves, a moment in history that transformed America from a peaceful nation into a global superpower. But first, they were just young men doing their jobs on a Sunday morning in paradise. Those crucial moments took away their lives, their futures, and their chance to see America win the war they helped start. But those same moments gave America the motivation to fight that war with determination that ultimately proved unstoppable. The Arizona explosion was the end of 1,177 individual stories. But it was also the beginning of the American story that still shapes the world today. In those crucial moments, everything changed. And America has never been the same since. The second wave of Japanese aircraft, arriving in the late morning hours, expected little organized resistance. By this point, however, American ships and shore batteries had begun to respond in force. The surprise attack was becoming a fair fight, and the Japanese were about to learn why that was a very bad idea. For over an hour, Pearl Harbor had been a shooting gallery where Japanese pilots could attack American ships with relative impunity. Most American sailors were still trying to understand what was happening, while Japanese bombs and torpedoes systematically destroyed the Pacific Fleet. But by mid-morning, understanding had crystallized into rage. American gunners who had been caught in their bunks were now manning every anti-aircraft weapon they could find. Sailors who had been writing letters home were now loading ammunition and sighting targets. Officers who had been planning shore leave were now coordinating defensive fire. The sleeping giant was not just awake, it was furious. The second wave consisted of dozens of dive bombers, high-level bombers, and fighter escorts. Source counts vary by type, but the force was large and meant to finish the devastation begun by the first wave. They expected to find burning ships, scattered defenses, and demoralized Americans. What they found instead was concentrated anti-aircraft fire from ships, shore batteries, and any gunners who could man a weapon. Every ship still afloat was firing every weapon that would bear. 5-inch naval guns, designed to fight other ships, were elevated to maximum angle and pumping shells into the sky. 50 caliber machine guns chattered from every available mounting. Even small arms were being fired at Japanese aircraft by sailors who refused to remain helpless. The sky above Pearl Harbor became a deadly constellation of exploding shells, tracer bullets, and burning aircraft. For the first time since the attack began, Japanese pilots were dying faster than Americans. As the second wave began its approach, the battleship USS Nevada was attempting something that naval experts considered impossible, escaping from Pearl Harbor while under direct enemy attack. The Nevada was the only battleship to get underway during the entire attack. While her sister ships remained trapped at their moorings, Nevada's crew had managed to light additional boilers and build up steam pressure. Ensign Joseph Taussig Jr. had made the decision hours earlier to keep an extra boiler online, a routine precaution that became the difference between mobility and helplessness. Now the Nevada was moving under her own power, heading for the harbor entrance and the open sea. Japanese pilots immediately recognized the threat. A battleship that reached open water could coordinate with other American forces and serve as a rallying point for American counterattacks. More importantly, Nevada's escape would prove that American naval power could survive and fight back. So the Japanese concentrated everything they had on stopping the Nevada. Dive bombers peeled off from their assigned targets and dove toward the moving battleship. High-level bombers shifted their aim points to intercept Nevada's course. Fighters strafed the ship's deck to suppress her anti-aircraft fire. Nevada fought back with everything she had. Her 5-inch guns fired so rapidly that their barrels began to overheat. Machine gunners swept the sky with continuous fire, creating walls of bullets that Japanese pilots had to fly through. Nevada managed to get underway and steamed for the harbor entrance, drawing intense Japanese attack. After sustaining multiple bomb hits and heavy damage, her captain elected to beach her rather than risk blocking the channel. The ship ran aground at Hospital Point, her bow pointing defiantly toward the sea she would never reach. Nevada's escape attempt had failed, but her fight had succeeded in ways her crew couldn't yet understand. For the first time since the attack began, Americans had seen one of their ships fighting back effectively. Nevada had absorbed the concentrated fury of the Japanese Air Force and remained defiant. She had proven that American warships could fight, American sailors could adapt, and American determination could survive devastating surprise attacks. The sleeping giant wasn't just awake. It was learning to fight back. While Nevada battled Japanese aircraft in the harbor, an even more unlikely drama was playing out at Wheeler Army Airfield. Accounts tell of pilots, some reportedly in their pajamas, racing to scattered aircraft and getting aloft in anything they could fly. One pilot, Lieutenant Philip Rasmussen, later recounted his hurried, barefoot takeoff. Rasmussen was awakened by the sound of explosions and machine gun fire echoing across Oahu. That assumption lasted until he looked out his barracks window and saw Japanese aircraft strafing the airfield. He grabbed a .45 caliber pistol and ran toward the flight line, wearing nothing but pajamas and bare feet. He wasn't planning to engage enemy aircraft with a sidearm. He was hoping to find an airplane. The flight line at Wheeler Field looked like a vision of hell. American aircraft were lined up wingtip to wingtip, exactly as General Short had ordered to protect them from sabotage. The tight formation that was supposed to prevent ground attacks had made them perfect targets for air attacks. Dozens of fighters were burning. Fuel tanks exploded regularly, sending pillars of black smoke into the sky. Japanese fighters continued strafing runs, destroying aircraft faster than American ground crews could drag them to safety. But miraculously, a handful of American fighters had escaped destruction. They sat scattered around the edges of the airfield, damaged but potentially flyable. Rasmussen and several other pilots began a desperate race to get airborne before Japanese fighters returned. They had no time for pre-flight inspections, no time to check weather conditions, no time to coordinate with air traffic control. They had time only to climb into cockpits and hope their engines would start. Rasmussen's P-36 started on the third try. He taxied toward the runway while Japanese bullets sparked off his wingtips. His radio was dead, his compass was spinning wildly, and one of his machine guns was jammed. He was flying a damaged fighter while wearing pajamas and no shoes. When Rasmussen encountered a formation of Japanese fighters over central Oahu, he attacked immediately. His P-36 was inferior to the Japanese Zero in almost every performance category. He was outnumbered 4-1. His aircraft was damaged, and his weapons were unreliable. None of that mattered. Rasmussen was an American fighter pilot whose country was under attack. He was going to fight. The aerial combat that followed was brief and vicious. Rasmussen's first burst of machine gun fire damaged the lead Japanese fighter. His second attack set a Zero on fire, sending it spinning toward the ground. But the remaining Japanese fighters quickly gained the advantage. Rasmussen's P-36 was hit multiple times. His engine began losing power, and his controls became increasingly unresponsive. He managed to crash land his fighter, climbed out of the wreckage, and immediately began looking for another airplane to fly. He was still wearing pajamas, still barefoot, and still ready to fight. By the end of December 7th, the handful of American pilots who managed to get airborne from Wheeler Field had shot down 11 Japanese aircraft. It was a tiny number compared to the hundreds of Japanese planes involved in the attack. But it was proof that American fighting spirit could hold their own against the supposedly invincible Japanese military machine. The sleeping giant was learning to bare its teeth. But America's awakening to war came with costly lessons about the chaos of modern combat. During the morning, 18 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the aircraft carrier Enterprise approached Pearl Harbor, expecting to land at Ford Island and refuel. The Enterprise had been delayed by storms and was still 200 miles west of Oahu when the Japanese attack began. The SBD pilots could see smoke rising from Pearl Harbor from 50 miles away, but they assumed it was the result of some kind of training accident. Nothing in their training had prepared them to believe that Pearl Harbor could be under actual enemy attack. As the Enterprise aircraft approached Ford Island, they were met by anti-aircraft fire from American gunners who were by now shooting at anything that flew. The gunners couldn't distinguish between American SBDs and Japanese dive bombers in the heat of combat. American anti-aircraft guns opened fire on American aircraft. The SBD pilots tried desperately to identify themselves as friendly aircraft. They waggled their wings, flashed their navigation lights, and attempted to contact the control tower by radio. None of their recognition signals worked. Several aircraft arriving from the carrier Enterprise were lost amid a chaos of anti-aircraft fire and enemy action. Some of those losses were later attributed to friendly anti-aircraft fire. American pilots were killed by American bullets, fired by American gunners trying to defend American territory. The friendly fire incident revealed something disturbing about the psychology of combat. When people are frightened and angry enough, they will shoot first and ask questions later. American anti-aircraft gunners had been caught completely off guard by the Japanese attack. They were determined not to be helpless again. So they shot at everything that flew, regardless of identification markings or recognition signals. The tragedy was compounded by the arrival of B-17 Flying Fortress bombers from California. These were the aircraft that Lieutenant Tyler had mistaken for the Japanese attack formation on radar earlier that morning. Instead, they flew into the middle of the Pearl Harbor attack with their guns unloaded and their crews unprepared for combat. Several B-17s were damaged by both Japanese fighters and American anti-aircraft fire. American gunners who had never fired shots in anger were learning to fight by fighting. American pilots who had never seen enemy aircraft were learning aerial combat by surviving aerial combat. American commanders who had never faced coordinated attacks were learning crisis management by managing crisis. The learning curve was steep, expensive, and paid for in American blood. But Americans were learning. And with each lesson, they were becoming more dangerous to their enemies. While battleships burned and aircraft fought overhead, American destroyers were hunting Japanese submarines in a deadly game of hide and seek. The destroyer USS Ward had fired the first shots of the Pacific War when it sank a Japanese midget submarine attempting to enter Pearl Harbor. But that submarine was only one of 5 two-man submarines that Japan had deployed to coordinate with the air attack. The other 4 midget submarines were still somewhere in Hawaiian waters, carrying torpedoes and orders to attack American shipping. Finding and destroying them became an urgent priority for American naval forces. The destroyer USS Helm spotted another midget submarine snagged on a reef near the harbor entrance. Helm immediately opened fire with her 4-inch guns, but the small target was difficult to hit in the shallow water. The submarine broke free from the reef and attempted to submerge, but Helm continued the pursuit. American destroyer crews were excellently trained in anti-submarine warfare. They knew how to use sonar, how to coordinate depth charge attacks, and how to track submerged targets. But they had never faced an enemy submarine in actual combat. Training exercises used predictable patterns and safety procedures that didn't apply to desperate enemy crews fighting for their lives. The Japanese midget submarines were small, maneuverable, and operated by crews who expected to die in the attack. They could hide in shallow water where American destroyers couldn't follow. They could take risks that no training exercise would simulate. But American persistence eventually won out over Japanese desperation. The destroyer USS Monaghan spotted a midget submarine attempting to attack ships in the harbor. Monaghan's captain ordered full speed ahead, and attempted to ram the submarine. The ramming attempt missed by only 50 yards, but Monaghan immediately dropped depth charges in the submarine's wake. The explosions occurred in such shallow water that they lifted Monaghan's stern out of the sea and damaged her steering mechanism. Out of control, the destroyer crashed into a barge, but suffered only minor damage. The midget submarine was not so fortunate. Monaghan's depth charges crushed its hull and killed both crew members. American destroyers and patrol craft engaged the midget submarines. Several were sunk. One was later found beached and its crew captured, and one remained unlocated for some time. The submarine hunt revealed something important about American military culture. Americans might be caught off guard, but they wouldn't stay off guard. Once American forces understood what they were facing, they adapted quickly and fought effectively. They made mistakes, but they made fewer mistakes each time. They took casualties, but they inflicted more casualties than they received. Most importantly, they refused to give up. The sleeping giant was learning to hunt. By late morning, the Pearl Harbor attack was effectively over. Japanese aircraft had expended their bombs and torpedoes. American defenses had finally organized effective resistance. Both sides had learned harsh lessons about modern warfare. But the most important transformation was psychological rather than tactical. Early that morning, America had been a peaceful nation with a peacetime military mindset. American servicemen thought in terms of training exercises, routine procedures, and administrative regulations. American strategy assumed that wars happened to other people in other places. By mid-morning, America had become a nation at war with a wartime mentality. American servicemen thought in terms of life and death, victory and defeat, and killing enemies before enemies killed them. American strategy now assumed that wars could happen anywhere, at any time to anyone. The sleeping giant had not just awakened, it had been transformed. Lieutenant Rasmussen, flying combat missions in his pajamas, represented the new American military, improvisational, aggressive, and completely committed to fighting regardless of circumstances. The crew of USS Nevada, steaming toward enemy fire while their ship burned around them, represented the new American Navy, determined to fight even when fighting seemed hopeless. The destroyer sailors hunting Japanese submarines represented the new American approach to warfare: learn by doing, adapt by surviving, and win by refusing to quit. None of these transformations had been planned or predicted. They emerged from the crucible of combat itself. Americans discovered they could fight by fighting. They discovered they could win by refusing to lose. The Japanese had achieved tactical surprise at Pearl Harbor. They had damaged the Pacific Fleet and killed thousands of Americans. They had demonstrated the power of coordinated air attacks and the vulnerability of static defenses. But they had also awakened something in America that would ultimately destroy them. The sleeping giant was no longer sleeping. It was awake, angry, and learning to fight. And it would not rest until its enemies were completely defeated. By mid-morning, the United States had been transformed, a peacetime nation into a mobilized wartime power. What emerged over the next months would make America an extraordinarily powerful and dangerous military actor on the world stage. Japan would spend the next 4 years learning exactly how dangerous it could be. 1:30 p.m., December 7th, 1941. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox bursts into President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's private study, interrupting a quiet Sunday meeting with advisor Harry Hopkins. Knox's face is ashen, his voice trembling. "Mr. President," Knox says, "the Japanese are attacking Pearl Harbor." Roosevelt's response surprised everyone in the room. No shock. No exclamation of disbelief. No sudden movement or emotional outburst. Just cold, calculating silence. Eleanor Roosevelt, who witnessed her husband's reaction, would later describe it as dead calm, the most frightening thing she had ever seen. She sensed that beneath Franklin's composed exterior, something momentous was taking shape. The sleeping giant hadn't just been awakened. It had been given a leader whose response would reshape the entire world. Roosevelt's calm reaction wasn't shock or denial. It was the response of a leader who had long anticipated this moment. For 3 years, Roosevelt had watched Nazi Germany conquer most of Europe, while America remained stubbornly isolationist. He believed America needed to enter the war to save democracy. But American public opinion was firmly opposed to foreign military involvement. Congress wouldn't declare war without direct provocation. The military wasn't psychologically prepared for global conflict. Pearl Harbor had just changed all of those conditions simultaneously. Japan had provided the direct provocation that American democracy required. They had unified American public opinion behind military action. They had created the psychological conditions necessary for total war mobilization. Most importantly, they had given Roosevelt the political authority to transform America's role in the world. While Knox provided additional details about the attack, Roosevelt's mind was already working on the response that would define his presidency. The calm determination that Eleanor observed would soon become the driving force behind America's emergence as a global superpower. At 4 p.m., Roosevelt placed a transatlantic telephone call to British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but it would determine the course of the next 4 years. "Mr. President," Churchill said, "what's this about Japan?" "It's quite true," Roosevelt replied. "They have attacked us at Pearl Harbor. We are all in the same boat now." Churchill later wrote that he felt profound relief upon hearing those words. For 2 years, Britain had fought Nazi Germany essentially alone, while America provided material support, but remained officially neutral. Now America would be forced to enter the war as a full belligerent. But Churchill may not have fully grasped what Roosevelt meant by the same boat. Roosevelt wasn't just agreeing to coordinate military strategy with Britain. He was signaling that America would assume a leading role in the Allied war effort. The same boat would increasingly become an American-commanded vessel, powered by American industrial might. Pearl Harbor had positioned America to become the senior partner in the most powerful military alliance in history. The attack that was supposed to keep America out of global war had just guaranteed American leadership of global war. That evening, Roosevelt sat in his study with Secretary Grace Tully, dictating what would become one of the most important speeches in American history. Every word was chosen for maximum psychological impact. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The phrase, "date which will live in infamy," was carefully crafted rhetoric designed to brand Pearl Harbor into American memory forever. Roosevelt wanted to ensure that Americans would remember this attack as a defining moment in their nation's history. The speech continued, "No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. Absolute victory was another carefully chosen phrase. Roosevelt wasn't promising merely to defend American territory or restore the status quo. He was promising to completely destroy Japan as a military power. The speech established themes that would echo through American foreign policy for decades. The moral authority of a nation attacked without warning. The determination to achieve complete victory over aggressors, and the responsibility to prevent future surprise attacks. The speech took only 6 minutes to deliver, but its influence on American foreign policy would last for generations. The promise to prevent another Pearl Harbor would become a recurring justification for American military presence around the world. Roosevelt had transformed a military defeat into the ideological foundation for America's emergence as a global power. December 8, 1941, 12:30 p.m. Roosevelt addresses a joint session of Congress in the House chamber, packed with legislators who had been isolationist 24 hours earlier and were now demanding immediate war. The transformation was remarkable. On December 6th, most congressmen opposed American involvement in foreign wars. On December 8th, they were competing to demonstrate their patriotic support for military action against Japan. Roosevelt's speech to Congress lasted only 6 minutes, but the psychological impact was immediate and overwhelming. When he finished speaking, the chamber erupted in sustained applause. Legislators who had spent years arguing against military spending were now demanding maximum mobilization for total war. The congressional vote for war was nearly unanimous. 388 votes in favor, 1 vote against in the House, unanimous in the Senate. The single dissenting vote came from Representative Jeannette Rankin of Montana, the first woman elected to Congress and the only person to vote against American entry into both world wars. Rankin's vote required extraordinary personal courage. Her colleagues booed and hissed when she cast her ballot. "As a woman, I can't go to war," she explained, "and I refuse to send anyone else." It was the last principled isolationist statement that would carry significant political weight in America for a generation. Pearl Harbor had fundamentally weakened isolationism as a viable political force in America. From December 8th forward, politicians who opposed American military intervention abroad would face accusations of inviting another Pearl Harbor. The vote for war wasn't just approval for military action against Japan. It was the beginning of America's transformation into a permanent global military power. That evening, Eleanor Roosevelt addressed the nation on her weekly radio program. Her words revealed how completely Pearl Harbor had transformed American psychology in a single day. For months now, the knowledge that something of this kind might happen has been hanging over our heads, Eleanor said. That is over now, and there is relief in knowing it. The relief Eleanor described wasn't just about ending uncertainty. It was about ending the psychological strain of trying to remain neutral while democracy was threatened in Europe and Asia. "Whatever is asked of us, I am sure we can accomplish it," Eleanor continued. "We are the free and unconquerable people of the United States of America." The phrase, unconquerable people, was significant. Eleanor wasn't just expressing confidence in American military capabilities. She was asserting American moral superiority over enemies who had attacked without warning. Americans were unconquerable, not just because they had better weapons, but because they represented freedom and democracy against tyranny and aggression. This moral authority would help justify whatever military action was necessary to defeat America's enemies. Eleanor was articulating themes that would support American global military engagement for decades to come. Pearl Harbor had given America the moral authority to expand its military presence around the world in the name of preventing future attacks on democracy. Eleanor Roosevelt was announcing America's emergence as a global power justified by righteous purpose. Within 24 hours of Pearl Harbor, America had been fundamentally transformed from an isolationist democracy into a mobilized military power committed to global engagement. The change wasn't just military or political, it was psychological and cultural. Americans stopped thinking of themselves as a people protected by oceans from foreign threats. They began thinking of themselves as a people responsible for defending freedom against tyrannical enemies anywhere in the world. This transformation accelerated changes that Roosevelt had been hoping to achieve for years. He believed that America needed to become a global military power to prevent totalitarian dominance of the world. But American democracy required popular support for such a dramatic change in national strategy. Isolationism was deeply rooted in American political culture. Pearl Harbor had swept away those beliefs in a single day. Americans, who had opposed foreign wars on December 6th, were demanding global military action on December 8th. Politicians who had campaigned against military spending were now authorizing unlimited defense budgets. Citizens who had insisted that foreign problems required foreign solutions were now accepting American responsibility for solving global problems through American military power. The psychological impact was so complete that most Americans didn't recognize how fundamentally their worldview had changed. They thought they were simply responding to Japanese aggression. They didn't realize they were participating in the creation of conditions that would support America's emergence as the world's dominant military power. Roosevelt recognized the magnitude of the transformation. Pearl Harbor had given him the political support he needed to lead America into a position of global leadership. The Japanese attack had created the political conditions for America's rise to superpower status. Pearl Harbor didn't just bring America into World War II. It created the psychological conditions that would support America's permanent engagement in global military affairs. Before December 7th, Americans viewed military spending as a temporary emergency measure. After Pearl Harbor, Americans came to view military strength as permanent insurance against future surprise attacks. Before December 7th, Americans viewed foreign military bases as temporary wartime expedients. After Pearl Harbor, Americans would come to view overseas military presence as essential protection against enemies planning another surprise attack. Before December 7th, Americans viewed intelligence agencies as unnecessary violations of democratic privacy. After Pearl Harbor, Americans would accept intelligence operations as essential protection against enemies preparing the next Pearl Harbor. The attack created a psychological framework that would outlast World War II by decades. Americans would never again tolerate the kind of military unpreparedness that had made Pearl Harbor possible. They would support maintaining military superiority over potential enemies, regardless of cost. By the end of World War II, America would have military bases on multiple continents and naval forces in every major ocean. By the end of the 20th century, America would be maintaining military capabilities greater than most other nations combined. Much of this expansion would be justified by the promise that there would never be another Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt's response to Pearl Harbor had helped create the political conditions for the most powerful military establishment in human history. An establishment dedicated to ensuring that no enemy would ever again catch America unprepared. Pearl Harbor had awakened a sleeping giant. But it had also created a giant that would maintain permanent vigilance against future threats. And the world has been shaped by the consequences ever since. December 7th, 1945. Exactly 4 years after Pearl Harbor, President Harry Truman sits in the Oval Office reviewing intelligence reports from around the world. American military forces are now deployed across multiple continents. American naval power dominates the world's oceans. American influence extends to virtually every corner of the globe. The sleeping giant that Japan awakened at Pearl Harbor has become something that even Roosevelt never fully anticipated, a permanent global military power that would never again allow itself to be caught unprepared. But in creating unprecedented military capabilities, America has also created something unintended, a nation that struggles to distinguish between legitimate defense and imperial overreach. The transformation that Pearl Harbor helped accelerate would spend the next 80 years demonstrating that absolute security is impossible, absolute power is corrupting, and absolute preparedness requires absolutely everything. Pearl Harbor didn't just change American foreign policy, it helped transform the entire American economy into a permanent war machine. Before December 7th, 1941, American military spending was episodic and minimal. The military maintained small peacetime forces and expanded only during active wars. Defense contractors existed primarily to supply routine equipment and maintenance. Most Americans viewed large standing armies as threats to democratic government. The attack created political conditions that made permanent military preparedness seem like patriotic necessity. American defense spending never returned to pre-war levels, even after World War II ended. The argument was always the same. America could never again allow itself to be caught as unprepared as it had been on December 7th. Every potential threat required immediate response. Every technological advance by potential enemies required even greater American advances. By the early Cold War, American military spending far exceeded that of any other nation. Defense contractors employed millions of workers in congressional districts across the country. Military research and development was driving technological innovation in everything from computers to communications to transportation. The promise to prevent another Pearl Harbor had created what would become known as the military-industrial complex, a network of defense spending, corporate profits, and political influence that became too large and powerful to easily dismantle. President Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander who had helped win World War II, warned Americans in 1961 about the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. But by then, the pattern was established. Pearl Harbor had created a political dynamic that made permanent military mobilization seem like reasonable precaution rather than imperial choice. Any politician who questioned defense spending could be accused of inviting another surprise attack. Any citizen who opposed military expansion could be labeled unpatriotic or naive. The sleeping giant had become a perpetually awakened giant. Pearl Harbor's lasting impact included the creation of America's vast intelligence apparatus, a network of agencies and operations that would have seemed impossible to the founders of American democracy. The official justification was always consistent. Pearl Harbor happened partly because America lacked sufficient intelligence about enemy intentions and capabilities. Therefore, America needed comprehensive intelligence gathering to prevent future surprise attacks. The logic seemed compelling. until the intelligence apparatus grew beyond anything imagined in 1941. The Central Intelligence Agency, created in 1947, was initially designed to coordinate intelligence from existing agencies and provide strategic analysis to policymakers. It evolved into an organization that conducted covert operations, supported coups, and engaged in activities that the Church Committee would later investigate and criticize. The National Security Agency, established in 1952, was created to intercept and decode foreign communications. It eventually developed capabilities to monitor electronic communications on an unprecedented scale. Multiple intelligence agencies proliferated throughout the American government. Defense Intelligence Agency, FBI counterintelligence divisions, military service intelligence branches, and specialized units within cabinet departments. Each justified its existence by invoking the specter of another Pearl Harbor. By the 21st century, American intelligence agencies employed hundreds of thousands of people and spent tens of billions of dollars annually. The intelligence community had become a massive bureaucratic structure, operating largely beyond traditional democratic oversight. The irony was profound. Pearl Harbor's lesson about the dangers of being unprepared had contributed to creating a surveillance apparatus that posed challenges to the very freedoms it was designed to protect. But every attempt to reform or constrain intelligence operations met familiar responses. What if enemies are planning another Pearl Harbor? What if crucial intelligence is missed because of legal restrictions? What if threats go undetected? Pearl Harbor had helped create a psychology that made extensive intelligence gathering seem like reasonable precaution rather than potential overreach. Perhaps the most visible consequence of the Pearl Harbor era was America's transformation into a nation that maintained permanent military forces around the world. Before Pearl Harbor, Americans generally viewed overseas military bases as temporary wartime expedients that should be abandoned when conflicts ended. The attack helped create acceptance of global military presence as essential insurance against surprise attacks from any direction. The logic seemed compelling. Pearl Harbor demonstrated the dangers of isolation and unpreparedness for global conflict. Therefore, America needed forward-deployed forces that could respond immediately to threats. Early warning required bases near potential adversaries. Deterrence required visible demonstrations of American military capability. American military installations spread across Europe, Asia, and the Pacific during the Cold War. By later decades, American forces were stationed on multiple continents. Modern estimates suggest America operates hundreds of military facilities worldwide. Each installation often justified additional installations. Bases required supply lines, which required additional facilities to protect those supply lines. Regional commands required subordinate commands with their own infrastructure. Training exercises required permanent ranges and support facilities. The global presence became self-perpetuating. Military commanders identified new threats requiring additional capabilities. Defense contractors developed new technologies requiring new facilities. Political leaders faced constituencies benefiting from local military spending. Contemporary America spends more on overseas military operations than most countries spend on their entire governments. American military personnel are permanently deployed in more countries than historical empires ever controlled. The promise to prevent another Pearl Harbor had contributed to creating a global military presence larger than any in human history. But it was a presence that many Americans didn't recognize as imperial because it was justified by defensive rather than offensive purposes. American bases weren't conquering territory, they were protecting freedom. American forces weren't imposing control, they were maintaining peace and stability. Pearl Harbor had helped create psychological frameworks that allowed Americans to build global military dominance while believing they were simply defending themselves. Perhaps the most profound consequence of Pearl Harbor was psychological. It contributed to a national mindset that viewed peace as potentially dangerous and permanent military readiness as necessary reality. Before Pearl Harbor, Americans generally assumed that wars were temporary disruptions of normal, peaceful life. Nations fought when they had conflicts, then returned to peaceful relations when conflicts were resolved. Military forces existed to fight wars, not to maintain permanent readiness for hypothetical future conflicts. After Pearl Harbor and the Cold War that followed, many Americans came to believe that peace was simply the interval between wars, and that wise nations used peacetime to prepare for inevitable future conflicts. The question wasn't whether there would be another war, the question was when, where, and with whom. This psychological shift had enormous consequences for American politics and culture. Military virtues, discipline, hierarchy, readiness, became more prominent in civilian discourse. Educational and political institutions emphasized competition and preparation. Popular culture increasingly celebrated military themes. Americans often came to view their government's military actions as inherently defensive and legitimate, while viewing other nations' military actions as potentially aggressive and threatening. American intelligence operations were protecting freedom. Foreign intelligence operations were threatening democracy. American military bases were maintaining peace. Foreign military bases were potentially expanding hostile influence. Pearl Harbor had contributed to a permanent sense of vulnerability that could justify unlimited preparation against any perceived threat. America would never again be the victim of a surprise attack, because America would maintain capabilities to respond to anyone who might be planning surprise attacks. The sleeping giant had become a giant that found it difficult to sleep and too powerful to be easily restrained. The promise to prevent another Pearl Harbor had contributed to creating a nation that was always preparing for the next Pearl Harbor, always identifying potential Pearl Harbors, and always maintaining military capabilities to prevent attacks that might never be planned by enemies who might never materialize. By the early 21st century, the long-term consequences of America's post-Pearl Harbor transformation had become visible to careful observers. The military-industrial complex consumed resources that could have rebuilt infrastructure, improved education, or enhanced healthcare. The intelligence apparatus sometimes challenged civil liberties that Americans had fought wars to preserve. The global military presence created resentment among populations who viewed American facilities as symbols of domination rather than protection. Most ironically, the promise to prevent another Pearl Harbor may have created conditions that made surprise attacks more likely in some ways. America's global military presence provided targets for enemies who couldn't attack the American homeland directly. America's support for unpopular foreign governments sometimes created adversaries who had limited ways to strike back except through unconventional means. The September 11th, 2001 attacks on New York and Washington demonstrated that determined enemies could still achieve surprise despite decades of military preparation and intelligence gathering. The attacks killed thousands of Americans and revealed the limits of conventional military preparedness against unconventional threats. Rather than prompting reflection about whether permanent global military mobilization actually provided security, Americans responded to September 11th by expanding defense spending, enlarging intelligence capabilities, and increasing overseas military presence. The logic of Pearl Harbor seemed to demand ever greater military preparations against ever more sophisticated threats. The transformation that Pearl Harbor helped accelerate had become too large to easily control, too expensive to easily maintain, and too embedded in American politics and economics to easily abandon. It consumed American resources, complicated American democracy, and sometimes created American adversaries faster than American military force could neutralize them. But it remained a system that most Americans viewed as defensive rather than aggressive, because it had been shaped by the most morally clear-cut event in modern American history: the unprovoked attack on Pearl Harbor. The sleeping giant that Japan awakened on December 7th, 1941, had become a giant that found it difficult to sleep, difficult to rest, and difficult to stop expanding its capabilities against everything that could possibly threaten American security. Which, it sometimes seemed, included almost everything.